Episode 161, Offline Meeting. Early the next morning, Marvin went out in high spirits to get everyone breakfast. Alfred stopped charging himself and then knocked on the door one by one to call the others to come down for breakfast. Bessy saw Toby, who had woken up very early the moment she came downstairs. "Are you all right?" She was talking about how he had been drugged yesterday. Toby squeezed his wrists and looked up with his exquisite face. "It felt the same as before when I got up in the morning. The medicine Mr. Brown gave me was very useful." He was very intuitive and didn't ask who Daniel was. He had already been shocked when he entered Daniel's house last night, so he put this matter aside and chatted with Bessy about the game last night. Toby had also watched the live broadcast and had even used his whole family's property to bet on the 9.9 odds. He had won $1 million. The two chatted and talked about the game. This was the first time Bessy told him about the hidden skills that she had used on the field last night. Towards the end of their conversation, Alfred came out with breakfast. Bessy reached out for a bottle of milk and found that something felt wrong. She looked to the left. Michael had come down and was sitting not far away, watching the two of them talk. When he saw her glance over, he leaned back and chuckled once. Bessy looked away and drank her milk with her head lowered. Daniel also came downstairs, yawning. Robert had urged him to come down. Bessy looked at him and knew that the results of his final experiment had yet to come out. She lowered her head, picked up her phone, and saw that all major websites were filled with Daniel's tissue regeneration medical report. Daniel's final results had not come out yet. For the time being, Bessy didn't plan to return to Chicago. As Michael said before, she had to wait until Tuesday. She thought for a moment and then clicked on Noah Hyber's profile on Twitter. Address? ? After sending the message, Bessy threw the phone aside. She took a piece of bread and looked at Daniel. Before she could say a word, Michael said from opposite her, "When will the results come out?" A press release from the World Health Organization had already been issued. A huge commotion had been stirred up in the medical world. There had never been such a big scandal on the internet before. Not even by a celebrity. This evening, the first regenerated tissue catalytic mold will also come out. Daniel's usually blank expression was full of spirit at the mention of this. He sat next to Bessy and saw Michael staring at him blankly. Daniel paused and moved to the side again. Robert happened to be sitting next to Daniel and was a little sleepy. However, when he saw Daniel moving to the side, he also followed casually. "Michael, there is data that you need to help me stabilize." Daniel thought for a while and looked up at Michael. "When I get back to Chicago, I will head to our teacher's lab." Michael reached out and took a glass of water. He continued staring blankly and didn't speak again. Bessy took a bite of bread and was deep in thought. Noah Hyber had looked for her last night and she hadn't replied to him immediately. Her main purpose here in Devil City was to wait for Daniel's results. Now that Daniel's results would take a while to come out, she probably had time to meet Noah Hyber. After meeting, Michael and Daniel went to the third floor to sort out the final experimental results. Samuel had nothing to do after eating, so he looked at the message Sherry had sent him, inviting him to play. After thinking about it, he went to sit in front of the computer in the center of the hall. "Bessy, Sun God, do you want to play?" Samuel touched his ear stud and looked at Toby. Toby sat up from the sofa and shook his head. "No, I have to get back to the team." Toby didn't plan to stay any longer, since Daniel told him he was fine. Marvin took the key from the table and nodded. "I will see you out." "Okay." Samuel looked at Toby regretfully and then said he would also see him out. Bessy watched Samuel's back as they walked away, while touching her chin and thinking for a moment. Then, she returned to her room on the second floor. She looked down at her phone, but Noah Hyber had not replied. She turned on Daniel's computer and logged into her game account. Downstairs, Samuel saw Toby out and then went back to play the game. Today, neither Bessy nor Marvin were around, and Robert had followed both Daniel and Michael to the third floor. Samuel and Sherry played as a duo. "You're the only one who has time today?" Sherry's voice sounded gentle and polite. "Yeah, the others have matters to attend to." Samuel controlled his cards and followed behind Sherry. They didn't work well together, but still won ultimately. Since the first time he had played as a duo with Sherry, Samuel knew that they didn't have much chemistry. He had lamented that Bessy played the supporting role very well, but now that he knew the truth, he exited after one round. Sherry said. I heard from Marvin last time that you are all in Devil City? Yeah, Samuel originally wanted to start another round, but he saw another red dot on the logo in the upper right corner of the game, so he went to click on it. OST BM requested to add you as a friend. Samuel's hand shook as he accepted the request. Wait a moment, I still have a friend coming. Samuel didn't start immediately, but opened the friends page and invited Bessy to play as a trio with them. Bessy rejected him. Samuel was thinking, then why did you add me? When he saw a red dot in the mail area on the upper right corner of the game page. Something came to mind and Samuel stared at the mail closely. His slender fingers moved the mouse slowly and he finally opened the email. You have received a gift from your friend OST BM. Samuel's hand shook as he opened the mail. The same message that Michael had received enlarged on the game interface. In the game, Sherry waited for a long time and still didn't see Samuel's friend. She couldn't help but ask softly, Samuel, is your friend still coming? Oh, Samuel responded, finally returning to his senses after a long while. Sherry, I don't want to play anymore. Let's play another time. Then, he directly withdrew from the team. On the other side of the computer, Sherry frowned at Samuel's attitude. Noah Hyber was at his music video shooting location. He wasn't the protagonist of the music video and only casually cooperated with a few shots for the plot. The shooting location was a secret, but even so, a few screams could be heard every so often, and some staff members would even scream excitedly in Noah's direction. The people around Noah were already used to this. Noah was with the staff for the shoot and the manager kept Noah's phone in his pocket. It was already 1 o'clock when Noah finished shooting. The agent handed a long down jacket to him. There should be no more shots for you. The rest are of the 2 protagonists. If you're in a hurry, we will be able to return to Evanston tonight. The manager took out a book and explained to Noah the following schedules. Because of the shoot, Noah only wore a shirt and was slowly putting on his down jacket with his eyes low. His slender fingers carefully pulled the zipper up. He listened distractedly to the manager's arrangement. Where's my phone? He suddenly remembered something and looked at the manager. The manager glanced at the book and knew he already remembered most of the schedule, so he closed the book and stuffed it directly into his pocket. Then he took out the cell phone and gave it to Noah. He wasn't surprised to know that Noah was still waiting for Nico's reply. He handed a mask and a pair of sunglasses to Noah. While wearing the mask, Noah clicked on the phone and saw a message on the lock screen page. When Noah saw it was Bessy's message, his hand shook. This was Noah's private phone, and the manager didn't look at it. Noah paused in shock. He was probably frozen for 2 or 3 minutes. He froze for so long that the manager thought something was wrong. The manager was waiting for Noah Hyber to put on the mask, but when he saw that he remained unmoving for a long time, he couldn't help but turn around and raise an eyebrow. Noah? Noah responded and looked up at the manager. His dark eyes flashed brightly as he said, Nico just asked for the address. At Daniel's Manor, Michael had just finished several data specimens, and when he came down, he saw that Samuel was alone, staring at the computer. Michael just stood on the staircase and leaned back. His eyes swept past the hall and saw no trace of anyone else. He raised his delicate brows and looked at Samuel. Where's everyone? Needless to say, Samuel knew that Michael was specifically asking about Bessy, not Marvin or Toby. Bessy went out to meet her friend and Marvin took her. Samuel finally pulled his eyes away from the computer screen and turned to look at Michael. Michael, does Bessy have other friends in Devil City? She didn't tell me when I asked, and only said it was a friend. She was so secretive. She had also said she was meeting a friend last time, and it turned out to be Daniel. He wondered who the friend this time was. Samuel wondered if it would be someone else of Daniel's level as well. Hearing this, Michael took out a cigarette and put it in his mouth before glancing quietly at him. Samuel turned his head back inexplicably. You can call Marvin and ask him. On the other side of town, Marvin drove the car and used the navigation on his phone to arrive at the address Bessy had sent. After crossing a river, he arrived at the door of a quiet coffee shop. Marvin glanced at it quietly and thought it looked like a dating spot. Bessy, is this the right place? He parked the car opposite and looked at Bessy through the rearview mirror. Bessy was originally leaning against the window, but when the car stopped, she sat upright and looked around. Then she reached out to open the door and cleared her throat as she got out of the car. She was wearing a white sweater and a black coat today. She reached out to put up her hood to block the wind. This place was rather secluded, and it was also Monday, so there were not many people around. Bessy walked to the waiter directly and paused before asking in a cold yet polite voice, "Hello, where's room 12? Before long, Bessy stopped by the door of room 12, raised her hand, and knocked. Episode 162. Is This Not Love? Noah Hyber's private suite wasn't very big. A table was set up, and 4 sofa chairs were facing the window. Noah sat on the left with his hands resting on the table beside his sunglasses, cap, and mask. His long black down jacket had been hung up by his manager.
"Noah, do you think the real master will come?"
The manager didn't sit and just paced around in the open space, looking down at the phone occasionally.
"Yeah."
Noah Hyber looked calmer than the manager. After thinking about it, he glanced over at the manager again.
"How old do you think he is? Should I call him Mr. Rivera or Nico?"
Noah Hyber had known Nico for several years, but he still didn't know his age and appearance. The manager was also curious regarding this question, so he pondered for a while before saying,
"Just call him Mr. Rivera, do you hear me?"
The manager certainly didn't know Nico, but judging from the arrangements he made, especially the dark albums, he seemed to have experienced countless vicissitudes, and so could make arrangements that could touch people's hearts. From this, the manager guessed that Nico must not be young. Noah was 25 years old this year, so how could Nico be younger than him? However, it wasn't time to ask these questions. It was less than a minute till the time when Nico and Noah had agreed to meet, so the manager wanted to ask, was the great arranger willing to see him? He was still thinking about this when someone knocked on the door. It was calm and unhurried. The manager's heart leaped.
"It must be him."
He immediately went to the door. On the sofa behind him, Noah stood up sharply and stared in the direction of the door. The door opened quickly. The manager looked at the girl standing outside the door. The girl had the hood of her sweater pulled up and looked very young, but still mature. Standing there, she looked very cool.
"May I ask what the matter is?"
The manager looked at her young face and didn't even think that she could be Nico. Instead, he was worried that Noah had been recognized. With Noah's site traffic on the internet, it was fine if he had been recognized. But if he was exposed, it would be difficult for them to exit the coffee shop today. Yes, the manager suspected that Bessy was a fan. Bessy reached out and pulled off her hood, then looked at the agent with her delicate eyebrows raised slightly as she responded concisely, "I'm looking for Noah Hyber." She pulled down her hat and her entire face was revealed. Whether her facial features were viewed separately or together, they were still extremely beautiful, and the way she slightly raised her eyebrows revealed arrogance. The manager was accustomed to seeing beauties in the entertainment industry, but his eyes still lit up at the sight of Bessy. He sighed in his heart that if he was an entertainment artist's manager, he would not hesitate to persuade Bessy to follow him into the industry. With such a face, she need not do anything in the entertainment industry. The fans would still hold her up as an idol. Most fans looked at celebrities' faces first.
"Do you want his autograph?"
Noah had many fans, and the manager wasn't surprised. He always had Noah Hyber's autograph in his bag, which he used to appease the fans he met at any time. He kindly took out 2 signed photos from his bag and handed them to Bessy. Inside, Noah heard that it wasn't Nico and relaxed his excited heart. He sat back on the sofa and continued to look at his Twitter. Bessy reached out, squinted, and casually took the signed photo from the manager. She looked at it and held it in her hands without paying much attention to it. The manager waited for Bessy to leave, but unexpectedly, she still didn't leave even after taking the autograph. He looked at her in surprise, but before he spoke, he seemed to laugh lightly. She held the photo with one hand and put her other hand in her pocket. Calmly, she introduced herself to the manager word by word. "I'm Nico Rivera." The manager's amiable face froze. He took a deep breath as if he had seen a ghost.
"Wait, what did you just say? Nico what?"
What kind of joke was this? A little kid was Nico? The manager's voice went a pitch higher. He suspected that the little girl was joking with him. Bessy's phone vibrated in her pocket, and she took it out to show the manager Noah's message. "Nico, where are you?" Bessy replied, At the door of your room, your manager just gave me 2 of your autographed photos. After a minute, the 3 of them were seated in the room. Bessy sat on the right while Noah and his manager sat on the sofa on the left. Bessy put Noah's autographs aside and put her hands on the table. Outside, the waiter knocked on the door to deliver coffee. The manager opened the door with fluttering footsteps and brought in 3 cups of coffee. He placed a cup in front of Bessy. The sound of the coffee cup touching the table returned Noah to his senses. Somewhat in disbelief, he stared at Bessy and asked tentatively,
Nico?
Bessy turned sideways slightly. Her beautiful eyebrows lowered as she said casually and coldly, Yeah. Noah was speechless. This tone and reaction were exactly like the person he knew from Nico's messages.
I didn't expect such a great arranger to be so young.
After so many years in the entertainment industry, the manager was sophisticated and finally reacted. He pinched his palm and forced himself to appear calm. However, his heart was far less calm than on the surface. Even without asking, the manager could see that Bessy was only about 15. Then, at what age did she start composing and arranging for Noah? Why had she sought out Noah? The manager felt it was weird back then. There were so many famous singers in the entertainment industry, equally as famous as Noah. There were even others, such as Selena Lawrence, who didn't have any scandals either. But Selena Lawrence was a person with powerful family background. She was able to obtain her fame without many haters. Not only because of her character and talent, but also because of her strong family. But what did Noah have? His parents were divorced and he stayed with his mother, who was riddled with debt. The manager had yet to see his father even after so many years. When the manager took him on, he had been struggling in a talent show with a clean background. But Noah had been famous for so long, yet still had no scandals. And by the unwritten rules that everyone knew, nobody dared to go against him. The manager thought that a large part of it must be because of the extremely mysterious God-level arranger standing behind Noah, Nico. This big boss silently supported Noah. He either coveted beauty or talent. But what else could he covet from Noah? But now, the manager stared at Bessy's face, which was even more beautiful than Noah's, and suddenly felt like Noah seemed to have taken an unfair advantage. Bessy's face was enough to explode in popularity in the entertainment industry. The name Nico would be on the hot search list for more than 3 days. The manager coughed and gestured wildly towards Noah with his eyes.
God damn it, is this not love?
Noah didn't receive the signal. He just stared at Bessy, and it took him a long time before he finally returned to his senses. He picked up the cup of coffee and took a sip.
Nico, why did you suddenly meet me today?
I happened to have time. Bessy tapped her fingers on the table one by one. Is your mother okay? She looked at her phone and saw that Michael asked where she was, so she casually returned a message.
Yes.
Noah nodded. He had once told Nico about his family situation.
My mother is now working on the World Poker Tour.
He always wanted to see Nico, partly because he had met a soulmate, and also because he wanted to thank him for pulling him out of the mud. But now that he saw her in person, Noah was temporarily speechless. Marvin waited for Bessy to enter the coffee shop before parking the car on the side of the road. The coffee shop had a wide road and a parking lot opposite it. There were not many people there on the weekday. It was cold outside, so Marvin stayed in the car. He sat in the driver's seat and ran through several things in his mind. Sherry asked when they would go back to Evanston. So Marvin pressed his phone and was about to reply, but a message suddenly popped up on his chat page. Where are you? The sender had a black profile picture and sent a very cold message. Marvin sat upright hurriedly. As if the person was in front of him, he reverently replied and also sent a picture of the coffee shop that Bessy entered, which looked like a place for a date. Finally, he sent his GPS tag over. In Daniel's manner, Michael looked at Marvin's reply and his eyes narrowed. He then stood up and picked up the coat hanging to one side. He looked around to find the car keys and left.
Michael, where are you going?
Samuel sat by the computer and couldn't help but ask when he saw Michael walking away with the car keys. Michael pressed a finger against his lips and said casually,
I'm going out.
He looked down at his phone and saw Bessy's reply. She seemed to have nothing to hide and even sent him the room number. Michael raised an eyebrow. 20 minutes later, in the room at the coffee shop, Noah's manager took out his cigarette case and tried to get his client to smoke.
Noah, have a good chat with Nico. I will go out for a smoke break.
He also signaled wildly to Noah with his eyes. Just as he was frantically signaling to Noah, someone knocked very slowly on the door. Episode 163, Ordinary Online Friend. The manager hadn't ordered anything else. Who could be knocking on the door? The manager paused and turned to look at Bessy and Noah.
Nico, I will see who is outside.
He walked towards the door and reached out to open it. The manager smiled and opened the door.
May I ask?
As he looked up, he saw a pair of deep, beautiful eyes. The eyes slightly narrowed. They seemed to carry a coldness in them. The manager couldn't help but take a step back to look at the man in front of him. His eyes were dark and he wore a beige windbreaker that made his languid face appear even more unfriendly. There was an imposing air between his faint and brilliant eyebrows. The corridor outside could accommodate 3 or 4 people at the same time, but the manager still felt it was a little narrow at this time.
Are there 2 people inside?
Michael glanced at him and spoke calmly, his slender fingers carelessly gathering his trench coat. The manager inexplicably felt a burst of pressure and was even a little breathless.
Yes, may I ask who you are looking for?
He wanted to ask what this gentleman did. After so many years of working as a manager, the most powerful person he had seen was the head of the Soup Corporation's family. This included the head of the Soup Corporation's son, whom everyone in the company and the capital held with reverence. Even so, the manager felt like this man in front of him didn't suffer in comparison to the heir of the Soup family. Michael narrowed his eyes somewhat dangerously and didn't hurry to reply to the manager. Instead, he just glanced behind him. Following his gaze, the door behind the manager opened. Bessy was standing there, holding her black coat in one hand and putting the signed photo in her bag with the other. Noah was behind her. She finished with the photos and raised an eyebrow when she saw Michael.
You came so soon.
Michael nodded casually and quickly set his eyes on Noah. With Noah's current popularity, he had to wear a mask, a cap, and a scarf every time he went out. He was putting on his mask when he felt a sense of inexplicable pressure. He paused and raised his head to see a clear, handsome face. The man had already looked away from him to the person in front of him.
Do you have anything else?
Michael glanced at Bessy and asked patiently. No. Bessy walked towards him while slowly putting on her jacket. Let's go. Michael nodded at this and glanced thoughtfully at the manager.
Are you not inviting your friend for dinner?
Noah might not have noticed, but the manager heard a kind of declaration of sovereignty. The manager's expression changed a little, and he felt like he might have understood something just now. God damn it, was this not really love? No. Bessy buckled up her coat and glanced at Noah. You still have a shoot to do, right? Let's go. She followed Michael downstairs. Noah didn't think of anything other than music and had very few distractions in his mind, so he just stared at Bessy thoughtfully for a while before following his manager downstairs. The manager stared at Bessy and Michael as they left and felt like his mind had exploded. He was simply dumbstruck. Had everything he saw just now been a figment of his imagination? Nico didn't have those kinds of feelings for Noah? Then why did she always pay so much attention to him? The manager couldn't figure it out. He wasn't a greenhorn like Noah and naturally thought more about things like this. Noah had become very close to this person, who had always been taken care of and supported him. Who would be so kind for no reason? Or, the manager stared at Bessy's back as she left and thought, are the other people behind Bessy? The manager felt like his brain was about to explode. The manager whispered to Noah,
Are you not curious about that man's relationship with Nico?
Noah glanced at the 2 of them in front, and his eyes behind the sunglasses remained unchanged.
What does it matter?
The manager sighed.
Nico has helped you for so many years without reason. Are you not curious why?
The manager asked again.
It's not without reason. I gave her money.
Noah replied. For the first time, the manager looked at Noah and found it hard to explain himself in a few words.
Nico's clothes are all from high-end stores and are not for sale to the public. Do you think she doesn't have millions of dollars?
In the past, the manager assumed Nico had taken a fancy to Noah's beauty and talent. But now, Noah was indeed beautiful in the entertainment industry, but he was incomparable to those 2. Talent? Was the name God-level arranger Nico blindly bestowed by netizens? Outside the door, Marvin was still in the car. He immediately put down his phone and got out of the car when he saw Bessy and Michael coming down. Michael didn't say anything, and Bessy only nodded at him. Then, she turned sideways and waved casually to Noah and his manager.
Amazing, Bessy.
Marvin looked behind her and happened to see Noah, who had already wrapped himself up like a mummy. Was this Bessy's friend? What kind of weird clothes was he wearing? Marvin glanced at them and felt like those two people were not better than Toby and Daniel, so he simply looked away. Michael had also driven over, and Bessy went with him in his car. Marvin drove back alone, and when he returned to his driver's seat, he picked up his phone and placed it on the passenger seat to take a look. He had sent Sherry a message, but she had not yet replied. He put down his phone again. In the other car, Bessy sat in the passenger seat while Michael drove the car slowly. Other than the 2 traffic lights at the beginning of the route, the rest of the roads were highways. It wasn't a holiday, so the road was unobstructed. In less than half an hour, the 2 cars drove into the garage at Daniel's home. Marvin arrived a little later than Michael and Bessy. He went to get lunch. It was almost 2 o'clock in the afternoon, and they had yet to eat lunch. Samuel was already sitting at the dining table and had set all the tableware. When Bessy came in, he was talking to Alfred, but Alfred was mostly ignoring him.
You're back?
Samuel was extremely hungry and had wanted to order food, but ordinary people couldn't enter the house, and he didn't know how to open Daniel's door either. He was afraid that he would not be able to return if he went out. He was famished by the time Bessy came back. Yeah, Bessy threw her coat on the sofa while Michael was still parking. I will go up and call them down. She went up to the 3rd floor. Daniel was still standing next to a bunch of instruments. The cell phone on the table next to him kept ringing, but he ignored it.
Daniel,
Robert picked up his phone and glanced at it.
It seems to be an overseas call.
Daniel didn't even look up.
Decline it.
These were all calls from distinguished professors in the medical profession. The statement issued by the World Health Organization this morning shook the entire medical field.
Okay.
Robert declined the call. Bessy watched the 2 of them by the door for a while and touched her chin. Once Robert saw her, she asked, How old are you this year?
26.
Robert paused before answering. Oh, Bessy nodded and asked again, Do you know how old he is? She reached out and pointed in the direction of Daniel. Robert smiled. He had obtained information on Daniel all these years and was naturally very clear about this.
He's 24.
Bessy was speechless. So he already knew? Marvin and Michael had just returned when the 3 of them went downstairs together. Samuel was setting the dishes.
Bessy, I received your gift.
Samuel finally sighed in relief now that it was lunchtime. Bessy had just eaten 2 cakes in the coffee shop and wasn't particularly hungry. Samuel's intuition told him something was wrong, but he couldn't think of what it could be. He simply put this matter aside and thought of another question.
By the way, which friend of yours did you meet today?
Hearing this, Daniel also looked up and asked, in surprise,
What other friends do you have here?
No one. Bessy grabbed a piece of cake with her fork. Just an ordinary online friend.
Online friend?
Michael had not seen Noah's face today, but even if he had, he wouldn't have known that he was a famous singer. Yeah, we have known each other for several years but have never met. Bessy replied slowly, after eating a piece of meat. He happened to be in Devil City tonight, so we just decided to meet. Michael glanced at her and nodded. Robert and Samuel didn't relax after hearing Bessy say that it was just an online friend. The 2 of them still remembered that the musician she knew was Mr. Grint. Samuel looked directly at Marvin. Marvin felt Samuel's gaze on him, so he put down his fork, raised his head, and recalled the people he'd seen today.
It seemed like 2 people, but I've never seen them before.
He couldn't see Noah's face, and he had indeed never seen the manager's face before. Samuel sighed in relief. Bessy finally had an ordinary online friend. It wasn't an easy feat. It was Monday, and Anne had already left Chicago to head towards the capital. Grace had originally planned to go with her. However, since Andrea was sick, nobody else could take care of Bertha. Worried, Grace had decided to send Anne off and stay in Chicago. At 5 o'clock, she returned to the Smith family's house from a trip to the spa in the afternoon. Aunt Ruth came up respectfully to help her take off her coat. Her attitude towards her was as respectful as her attitude towards Elise. As soon as Aunt Ruth hung her coat on the hanger, Grace's phone rang in her bag. She walked to the sofa and bent her head to take the phone out. When she saw that it was the doctor, she paused for a moment before picking up.
Doctor?
The doctor didn't say much and instead asked her to come over to the hospital. David had also just come back and saw that Grace was frozen in place. He turned and asked gently, "What's wrong? Let's go to my dad's house to eat later." Grace panicked and her right eyelid twitched violently. She grabbed David's arm firmly and said, Go to the hospital." David naturally knew without thinking that something had happened to Bertha. He put on his coat again and took out his phone to call Daryl. It was peak rush hour traffic on the drive over. The traffic jams were severe. They reached the hospital after 40 minutes. Bertha was in the emergency room. "Doctor." Grace hadn't even brought her bag or phone. She grabbed the attending doctor who came out of the emergency room and asked, "How's my mother?" Bertha's attending doctor sighed, and his eyes were a little dark. "Her body is already at the end of its battle. Anyway." "Why? You have the CNS, right? Is it gone again?" Grace's body shook a little. "No, this morning's news." The doctor paused halfway and sighed again. "I'm foolish. Why would I tell you? Let's go and see Miss Wilson first. She's awake now and her spirit is very good. Notify the rest of your family members." With that said, he walked outside and took out his phone to call Bessy. Episode 164. Bessy finally arrives. Although the doctor didn't ask about the patient's family, Bertha had been in the hospital for nearly half a year and he could feel the delicate relationship between Bessy and Grace. Grace was indeed Bessy's mother, but in reality, she was as confused by Bessy as he was. The doctor recalled what Bessy once said to him and bent his head to find her number. He dialed it directly, but it went to the voicemail and nobody picked up. Not far behind him, Grace stood rooted to the spot, her eyes teary and widened in panic. After a long while, she finally reached out with trembling hands to take out her phone and call Andrea and the others. Daniel's results came out at 4 o'clock in the afternoon. He still had to settle several things, so Bessy originally planned to wait for him to catalyze the enzyme before returning to Chicago. But she started feeling inexpressibly uneasy after lunch in the afternoon. She couldn't even wait for an hour and went straight back to Chicago. Marvin and Michael followed her back. Samuel had come to see the OST game, and now that it was over, he naturally went back with Bessy as well. Robert took the 4 of them to the airport, and he wanted to ask Bessy why she was going back so early instead of waiting for a little while more for Daniel, but he saw her expression and didn't dare to ask. The 4 of them got on the plane, which took a while to fly to Chicago. Bessy was on the plane when Bertha's attending doctor called her. Samuel and Marvin sat together in a row while Bessy and Michael sat in another row. Michael noticed that Bessy's expression was uneasy, so he sat up and comforted her. "It's okay. Daniel's medicine should be out now." Bessy nodded and didn't say anything. The plane reached Chicago quickly. It was getting late. Chicago was much colder than Devil City, and when they came down from the airplane, they could see snowflakes outside and feel the cold, strong wind. The snowflakes melted when they fell to the ground. Bessy was still wearing the standard black coat that flared behind her as she walked on the road. Michael followed a step behind her and whispered something to Samuel. As if feeling the cold wind, he reached out and handed a scarf to Bessy. Marvin contacted someone to drive the car over. The atmosphere of the group was rather depressed, and even Samuel was unusually quiet and didn't joke around. Silently, Bessy carried her backpack and wrapped the scarf around her neck. It blocked the wind coming from all directions. Michael finished talking to Samuel and turned over. He reached out to tidy up her scarf before lowering his head and saying in a calm and steady voice, "Don't be afraid. It will be fine." At the hospital, Andrea and Pete arrived at the emergency room first. Andrea had yet to be discharged from the hospital, but she was still able to walk to the emergency room on crutches with Pete supporting her. Susan was still at home and had not arrived. David stood outside the door, his head lowered while he smoked. He frowned when he saw Andrea and the others, sighed, and then turned to let them in. "They are all inside." The corners of Andrea's mouth trembled as she went in. In the half a year that Bertha had stayed in the hospital, in addition to the Smith family and the dean, even Michael had visited before. This patient's importance was self-evident. At this time, several doctors stood in the emergency room even though it was already past the time to get off work. "Pete, come here." Bertha leaned on the pillow and appeared to be in a good state of mind. Her expression was gentle and peaceful. Pete felt inexplicably uncomfortable when he heard her. He walked over to her and sat on the chair that Grace had given up for him. His eyes were red, but he controlled his tears and said forcefully, "Grandma."
"Pete, do you still have the things I gave you?"
Bertha reached out and stroked his head with a gentle smile. Pete choked and nodded. Bertha murmured,
"That's good. That's good."
Her spirits improved, and she forcefully chatted with Pete and Grace. Before long, Susan rushed in wearing a coat. Bertha's condition wasn't as good by then. Susan stood beside Pete and greeted her. After saying a few words to her, Bertha turned her pair of murky eyes to look out of the door and murmured, "Where's Bessy? Bessy has not come back yet?" Pete held the old lady's hands and stared at her with his dark eyes. "She will be back soon. You should wait a little more." Daryl also rushed over. He glanced at David and asked about the situation.
"How is she?"
David couldn't bear to see the separation of life and death in the hospital and sighed before explaining to Daryl.
"The old lady probably cannot take it anymore."
It was as Daryl expected, so he was silent for a moment before sighing and nodding. He glanced into the ward with a grave expression.
"Bessy is still not back?" "I heard that she's still in Devil City. I don't know when she will come back."
David shook his head.
"Oh, I don't know if she can arrive in time."
Daryl sighed again, and while walking in, he said to David,
"The old lady probably knows that she cannot hold on anymore. Prepare whatever needs to be done after her passing."
The Wilson family had many old women and weak children. If anything happened to Bertha, David would have to preside over the overall situation. David followed him in. Only a few hours had passed, but Bertha seemed to have aged many years. Although her eyes were cloudy, they had always been bright, but now they appeared dark instead. At the sight of David, Bertha got up again and said a few words to him, telling him to get along well with Grace in the future. At this moment, Bessy finally arrived. She came inside alone while Marvin waited behind her. Samuel and Michael were downstairs. Both of them had deliberately stayed behind.
"What's the matter?"
Michael watched Marvin take Bessy up, then looked at Samuel while frowning deeply. Samuel took a deep breath and put down his phone. He glanced at Michael and said,
"Your guess about the CNS medicine might have been correct. Someone most probably targeted Bessy's grandma deliberately. Robert called me just now and told me that Daniel's flight has been cancelled for no reason."
Flights to Chicago had been getting cancelled recently. There were only a few flights to and from Devil City every day. Daniel and Robert's flight had been cancelled, and they had to wait until tomorrow morning for the next flight. It would be midnight by the time they reached Chicago. Nobody knew what would happen in such a long period. Robert and Daniel were probably afraid that Bessy would worry, so they had only told Samuel about this, and Samuel had also avoided telling Bessy. Samuel and Robert didn't know that Michael had a connection with the CEO of the airlines. But as long as these suspicions were involved, it was a good idea to tell Michael. Hearing this, Michael narrowed his eyes slightly and took out his phone from his pocket. He then walked to the other side and made a phone call. Michael took out a cigarette and bit on it with drooping eyes and a terrible expression. The temperature around him felt even colder than 30 degrees. Samuel stood at his original position, waiting until Michael finally ended the call and walked in his direction after a long while.
"How'd it go?"
Samuel looked at Michael. Michael put out his cigarette and threw it towards a nearby dustbin.
"He's aboard the plane. Let's go up."
He took 2 steps and then spoke in a plain tone.
"Call Uncle Soup to dispatch some manpower here."
Samuel nodded his head with an extremely serious expression and followed behind Michael as he thought of Bessy's soulless state. He felt pretty bad. Who was it? Who would want to attack an old grandma on purpose? When Bessy entered the emergency room upstairs, Pete was still sitting by the bed. He then grabbed Bertha's hand while Susan was crying uncontrollably at the side. He sat beside Bertha emotionless. It was only when Bessy entered that he lifted his head in a daze, looked at her and said,
"Bessy?"
"Yes, it's all right." Bessy patted his head. Pete's tears came falling in no time.
"Bessy?"
Bertha's eyes were blurry upon hearing Bessy's voice, and she forced herself to cheer up. Bessy fixed her gaze on Bertha and, with both hands tensed up, reached out to grab Bertha's hand. "Grandma, I'm here." Bertha was previously full of spirits, but it was tough for her to even say a word or take a breath now.
It's nice to see you. It brings back.
Bertha panted hard as she gazed at Bessy for a long time. Her gaze then crossed behind Bessy again, looking towards the door as Michael entered. He was covered in snow.
Mr. Clark, I think I want to have a chat with you alone.
She garnered her last bit of energy to sit upright and looked past everyone to Michael. Grace naturally remembered Michael, but David and Daryl had never met him before. Wearing a knee-length trench coat, Michael looked tall and charismatic, with great manners. With just a look, one would know that he was no ordinary person. Both David and Daryl froze for a moment. Bertha looked at Bessy as she said softly,
Everyone can leave.
Michael also lowered his head and looked at her. Bessy closed her eyes and stood up, exiting through the door. As Samuel had just gotten back in touch with Rick, his heart sank a little when he saw her come out, and he walked towards Bessy's side after putting away his phone. In the emergency room, Michael sat on the chair which was previously occupied by Pete. The door was then closed.
Mr. Clark.
Bertha raised her slightly shaky hand and looked at his pair of dark eyes which were filled with warmth. Word by word, she spoke extremely slowly.
Bessy's winter clothes were bought by you, right?
Her voice was a little strained. Michael's heart sank even more as he nodded his head very quietly.
That's good.
Bertha closed her eyes and managed to smile with some difficulty.
From the summer break onwards, I haven't bought anything for her. I can't survive past this winter anymore, and the person I can't bear to leave the most is her.
She grabbed Michael's hand even tighter.
Now I'm more assured.
Her cloudy eyes finally showed signs of a smile.
I have a request.
Bertha took a breath halfway through speaking before resuming her words while looking at Michael. Michael lowered his head steadily and looked at her.
Please continue.
Bertha gazed in the direction of the door.
Can you help me take good care of Bessy?
As early as half a year ago, Bertha was already aware of her condition and also took notice of Michael's presence during the incident with Bessy's hand injury. After so many years, nobody but Bessy herself could cure her rebellious nature. A few months before, Bertha had found out that Bessy had set a few alarms on her phone. And when the alarms went off, even though she tended to get frustrated, she would still remember to take her medications. That was Bertha's first encounter with Michael. Afterward, she fell sick and officially met him for the first time. Michael lowered his eyes and was seemingly guilty as he nodded his head under Bertha's gaze. Bertha finally heaved a sigh of relief while seemingly smiling.
It's about time for me to go.
Michael pursed his lips, stood up and opened the emergency room door. Upon seeing the door open, Grace and the others outside all rushed into the room.
Mom, doctor, please hurry.
Grace's cries echoed from the room. The doctors rushed inside immediately. Bessy raised her head and looked at Michael. Michael lowered his head slightly, reached out for her shoulder and softly said,
You should go in and see your grandma.
A large crowd of people rushed into the room. The doctor arrived and examined her, only to shake his head at Grace and Andrea, who was crying miserably.
Miss Wilson's body cells are being pushed to their limits. A medical report was issued this morning. If we're able to find a regenerating enzyme, there may still be a string of hope. Regenerating enzyme?
In the room, Grace and a few others were crying miserably, and perhaps only David and Daryl managed to maintain their cool. David looked at the doctor and asked in a low tone,
Where can we get it?
Grace also turned her head and nervously looked at the doctor as she opened her mouth while choking.
Doctor, I beg you to use whatever method there is.
The doctor shook his head and sighed.
The regenerating enzyme was just announced this morning, but any other specifications are not known to us. However, even if the enzyme is found, only Daniel Brown has it. He's a medical school graduate, but very few people have heard of his name. It will be hard even for the World Health Organization to find him.
Both David and Daryl had never even heard of Daniel before, but they had heard of the World Health Organization. Upon hearing what the doctor said, They also roughly came to understand how much of an impressive figure that graduate must be. David sighed. As Bessy looked over to Bertha, who was very much unconscious, her head started ringing loudly, making her unable to think and grasp hold of anything at all. Until she heard the doctor mention Daniel. She fiercely raised her head and fished out her phone with shaking hands. Yes, Daniel. With no number saved on her cell phone, she keyed in one number after another to dial Daniel. The call went through after just one beep. Episode 165. Everyone arrives at the emergency room. When Bessy and Michael left, Daniel's regenerative enzyme had not come out yet. Daniel picked up the call after only one ring.
Bessy, what's the situation there?
My grandma.
Bessy clutched her phone tightly and stared intently at Bertha. Her throat was tight and she couldn't finish her sentence.
I know. Michael already told me. I will get to the hospital in 20 minutes.
Daniel passed the medicine box in his hand to Robert.
Don't worry.
After he hung up, he turned towards Robert and asked in a deep voice,
Is the car ready?
Robert looked around and nodded towards the black Volkswagen.
Over there. Let's go.
Daniel thought the car would be at the exit and didn't expect to see the car parked pompously inside the airport. Usually he would have asked who had parked it so arrogantly, but it wasn't the right time now. He got into the car while thinking about Bessy's voice and took out a cigarette, distressed. He didn't speak, but his good-looking face was tense.
Daniel, do you still not believe in your ability?
Robert didn't know Bessy's grandma. Thus, he was probably the most rational one amongst them. Because all the important people in the world wanted to be friends with Daniel, Robert felt like as long as Daniel was there, Bessy's grandma would be fine.
I have seen her with one foot in the grave before.
Daniel looked at the snow outside the car window and his pale brows knitted together.
Even when she was on the brink of death, her condition wasn't as severe.
Bessy had been trembling in fear. Daniel lowered his eyebrows and spit out a smoke ring, not daring to associate the word fear with Bessy. Robert glanced at him from the side, and his mouth moved. He wanted to ask Daniel what had been the situation between him and Bessy at the time, and what he meant by being on the brink of death. In Devil City, Robert and Samuel had also asked Bessy about her affairs with Daniel. Bessy only said briefly. Near the end, Robert couldn't help but fish out another cigarette. He narrowed his eyes and wondered, what kind of situation does near the end mean? He was just thinking about this when his phone rang. It was a call from Michael. Robert put aside his cigarette and picked it up directly. Bessy hung up the phone in the hospital. She stared tightly at the time on the phone. She also clutched Bertha's hand, her eyebrows drooping and her lips pursed tightly. Pete crouched beside her. Bertha was already completely unconscious. Nobody cared about Bessy's situation, and Grace grabbed the doctor's hand to ask,
Can Mr. Brown save my mother? How can we contact him? It doesn't matter how much he asks for.
The doctor sighed and appraised the patient's condition.
It's not a problem of money, Mr. Brown.
He shook his head. David pulled Grace away and comforted her in a low voice.
Calm down. The doctor is right. It's not a question of money.
It was already so difficult to find Daniel in the United States. If they could hire him with money, why would the doctor's attitude be like this? A few steps away, Michael had just finished talking to Robert. He asked Rick's men to open a pathway for Daniel to ensure that there was no obstruction along the way. Samuel came in from outside with a mobile phone and said solemnly,
Michael, Uncle Soup and Officer Gomez's men are here.
Bertha's operation had been on the 22nd floor, and at this point, there were not many people in the hospital. Michael glanced at Bessy and saw that she was standing upright with an almost expressionless face. His usually lazy and inexplicably prideful eyes fell into silence as well. He closed his eyes and turned around. Eyes covered with frost, he took Samuel's phone and walked outside. He said concisely,
The hospital side entrance is open. They will arrive in 15 minutes.
Samuel followed him out and nodded.
Uncle Soup's men have come up already.
Both of them went down to pick up Daniel. Michael didn't know who was targeting Bertha, but he wanted to make sure that nothing would go wrong. David and Daryl had not yet reacted to why Michael and Samuel were there. They only vaguely saw figures in the corridor outside the door. Daryl glanced outside, and within a minute, a team of bodyguards wearing black suits and private clothes came up to keep the entire passage tightly guarded. No matter which direction he looked in, He felt ineffably apprehensive. They didn't seem like ordinary bodyguards, but trained soldiers. Everyone avoided them. Some people saw this and turned to another corridor, not daring to take that route. With weapons pinned at their waists and a violent aura exuding from their body, nobody dared to approach them. Even David and Daryl had never seen such a scene before.
Who are these people?
Daryl came out of the emergency room and was stunned for a moment before looking at David in doubt. David also narrowed his eyes and finally shook his head.
I don't know. It was probably due to the gentleman just now.
He was talking about Michael. As soon as Michael and Samuel had appeared, David and Daryl could feel that they were not ordinary, especially Michael. But they had searched in their minds for a long time and couldn't think of any figures similar to the two of them in Chicago. 10 minutes later, the dean and several directors came out of the elevator. Several black-suited men in the corridor blocked them directly and only let them in after asking Michael and confirming their identities.
Bessy.
The dean was very familiar with Bessy and had seen Andrea before. He greeted the two before instructing the doctors to install the equipment. Susan and Grace felt a little stunned at seeing the dean come in suddenly.
Mom, this...
Susan sobbed softly and looked at Andrea. Andrea was staring at Bertha in a trance and didn't reply. Pete didn't look at Susan either. He just reached out his bony hand and pressed Bessy's shoulder. By Bertha's bed was her EKG monitor, going slower and slower. After another 5 minutes, Michael and Samuel returned and came out of the elevator. 2 young men were behind them. One of them wore a white shirt and a casual down jacket while holding a medicine box in his hand. It was Daniel and Robert. The 2 rows of bodyguards standing in the corridor all gave way.
Michael.
Michael's usually relaxed face had a rare indifference. He nodded slightly before passing by them and walking directly into the emergency room. Robert, Samuel, and Marvin didn't enter. Soon, all unrelated personnel was cleared out of the emergency room. Only a group of doctors and Daniel stayed inside. As soon as Susan and the others came out, they realized how quiet the corridor was and saw the 2 rows of bodyguards standing in front. The emergency door closed. Bessy leaned against the wall on one side, her eyebrows drooping and a hand on her side. Her nails were deeply embedded in her palms and her joints were pale, but she didn't utter a single word. She could be seen to be trembling slightly upon closer inspection. Her figure had a sense of coldness that couldn't be melted away.
Bessy, those people just now.
Daryl looked at Bessy curiously. Grace wasn't clear-headed and only knew that the attending doctor had said Bertha had no hope. But now that a group of doctors went in, she looked up at Bessy and asked,
Did the doctors go in to save your grandma? Who are they? Are they reliable?
Bessy still hung her head and didn't speak. Samuel also ignored them. Robert didn't know Bessy's family, but he could tell that Grace looked similar to Bessy, so he nodded and replied politely.
That's Michael's, Daniel is inside. If he's unreliable, then you will not be able to find a more reliable person in the organization.
Grace and Susan didn't know what the World Health Organization was, but according to the attending doctor's description, it was probably not accessible to ordinary people, especially the name Daniel. It seemed like, besides Susan and Grace, even David and the others knew him. This was the man who couldn't be hired with money. Grace and Susan were the most shocked when they heard Robert say that Daniel was inside.
Daniel?
How did Bessy know Daniel? However, Bessy didn't reply. Samuel and Robert kept quiet and just stood on either side of her. A man in black heading up the corridor came over with a mobile phone and handed it to Robert.
Robert, Director Soup is calling.
David and Daryl didn't know Robert, but they were familiar with Director Soup. He was a politician who was on par with Chicago's Mayor Grant. In particular, this politician was from Evanston, so to a certain extent, Mayor Grant couldn't even compare to him. Daryl's expression changed.
Yes.
Robert took the phone and went to one side to pick it up.
Uncle.
Director Soup had not registered yet and stood in front of the study window.
What's the situation? Do I need to go over?
In one night, many high-level executives in Chicago had been alarmed, and he had already received several calls. He had begun to wonder if Chicago was facing another major incident, such as the case with the poison wolf, or the bombing incident 3 years ago. Robert lowered his voice and replied,
It's about Bessy's grandma, so you don't have to come. The situation,
He narrowed his eyes and thought of how Daniel's expression had not been good when he rushed out, so he couldn't help but shake his head.
I will tell you later.
He hung up. Director Soup didn't think much about it. He had an impression of Bessy's grandma and had also seen her at Mr. Grint's apprenticeship banquet the last time. She was a simple old woman, and Director Soup already knew that her condition had been a little bad back then. While he was deep in thought, his phone rang again with a call from Mayor Grant. Mayor Grant asked him about what was happening in Chicago. Director Soup had just asked Robert, and since Mayor Grant had a good relationship with Bessy, he didn't conceal it and told him honestly. He originally thought Mayor Grant would have had the same attitude as him. Unexpectedly, Mayor Grant's voice sounded extremely shocked over the phone.
What? Her grandma?
He heard the sound of Mayor Grant moving about, putting on his clothes in an anxious manner. He was probably putting on his coat and preparing to go out. Unsurprisingly, he was probably going to the hospital to find Bertha and Bessy. Mayor Grant hung up the phone hurriedly and Director Soup frowned slightly. He tapped his finger on the phone. It wasn't difficult to understand Michael's big movements regarding Bertha. After all, he was interested in the girl. But why was Mayor Grant so nervous? Mayor Grant went out in the middle of the night. Mrs. Grant had just finished taking a shower and watched as Mayor Grant put on his coat and took his car key.
Where are you going?
To the hospital. Mayor Grant had no time to explain and just rushed out to his car. Mrs. Grant frowned at this rare sight. Mayor Grant sat in the driver's seat and reached out for his phone to call Marvin. He asked about Bessy's current address and situation. Marvin concisely told him the floor number where Bertha was located. The Grant family's house wasn't far from the hospital. He arrived at the hospital in less than 20 minutes. Anxious, he rushed to the emergency room. As soon as he got off the elevator, he saw a group of people gathered outside the emergency room. The emergency room was still closed. A bodyguard was about to stop Mayor Grant, but Samuel saw him and said,
I know him, there's no need to check.
Samuel and Mayor Grant had cooperated several times before and were rather familiar with each other. The bodyguard immediately backed away and let Mayor Grant in. Samuel's voice caught the attention of the others, and David also looked up. He was holding a cigarette in his hand and thought the person who had just come in was a nurse or a doctor. After all, many nurses and doctors had come and gone. He didn't expect to see Mayor Grant and was stunned.
Mayor Grant?
Daryl and Grace also glanced over. Mayor Grant didn't reply. His gaze directly skipped over the Smith family to Bessy. He walked over and asked solemnly,
Bessy, is Miss Wilson okay?
Episode 166. The Final Goodbye. The weight of the Grant family in Chicago was beyond words. In the past, because of Bessy's relationship with Chairwoman Grant and Officer Gomez, Daryl had also paid attention to Bessy. As for Mayor Grant, the Smith family only had a little relationship with Mrs. Grant, and Thomas was acquainted with Jacob. David wanted to have a good relationship with Mayor Grant, but Mayor Grant's reputation was too big and he couldn't even meet him without a great deal of effort. So when Mayor Grant spoke to Bessy, the Smith family was all stunned. By paying close attention to the news in this city, one could often see Mayor Grant's face on the major news channels and newspapers. If he had been talking to Samuel and Robert, then the others could have understood. After all, the bodyguard had greeted Director Soup, so David and Daryl had already guessed Robert's identity. If it had been Director Soup, then it was no surprise that he knew Mayor Grant. However, Mayor Grant's remarks were directed at Bessy. His attitude towards Bessy was obvious, from his slightly lowered head and tone of voice. Daryl had felt a little sullen from the moment he arrived at the hospital. At this moment, he was extremely stunned and just gasped without saying anything. Bessy was leaning against the wall with her head lowered when she heard Mayor Grant. She looked up and her eyelashes trembled for a while before she shook her head and glanced in the direction of the emergency room. I don't know. She's still inside. Mayor Grant also followed her gaze and stared at the emergency room. He frowned and looked towards Samuel to greet him for the first time.
Samuel.
The two of them knew each other, but such an occasion wasn't fit for exchanging conventional greetings, and it wasn't appropriate to discuss anything else. They all just waited with Bessy. Robert glanced at Mayor Grant one more time and took a step back to ask Marvin in a lowered voice.
That's the mayor of Chicago, right?
Marvin was in a bad mood now. He looked at his phone. Sherry had sent a message, but he didn't reply. Hearing Robert's question, he nodded.
Yes, Mayor Grant and Bessy have known each other for a long time.
If this matter had come before knowing Bessy's relationship with Daniel and Officer Gomez, Robert would have been shocked to death. But since he had already experienced that shock before, this news only caused a ripple in his heart. The hallway was divided into two, Bessy and the others, with her leaned against the wall on the left. Grace, David, and the others, with them, stood on the right. Andrea and the rest stood in the middle. The boundaries were clear and well-defined. Susan finally stopped crying. She wasn't normally interested in the news and the newspaper and had never dealt with people on Mayor Grant's level. Thus, she naturally didn't recognize Mayor Grant. But she heard David greeting him. She glanced at Mayor Grant and the others on that side of the hallway. Because of Bertha's condition just now, she had not paid much attention to her surroundings. But now that she had calmed down, she realized that the surroundings were very different. Not to mention the people standing with Bessy. Mayor Grant was needless to say, but Samuel and Robert looked far more imposing than ordinary people as well, and their every movement held a sense of effortless nobility. At Anne's apprenticeship banquet, Susan had also seen many prestigious and rich people in Evanston, and had even exchanged contact information with several of them. But now, Susan felt like the people she knew were no match for the people around Bessy, in temperament, or in any other aspect. Susan's relationship with Bessy had been stiff since last time, so she naturally wouldn't ask her about these people. She felt inexplicably afraid when she saw Bessy. She glanced at Pete and whispered, "Pete, have you seen Bessy's friends before?" Pete's expression was blank, and he seemed rather unaffected, but the dark circles under his eyes were quite obvious. He didn't answer or say anything to Susan. He just stared coldly at her with a blank expression. His cold glance made Susan's body stiffen. She didn't have time to say anything. The emergency room's door opened. A group of doctors came out quietly, and Daniel was the last to come out. He reached out to pull down his blue mask and pursed his lips at Bessy.
"Bessy, your grandma asked you to come in."
Then he turned sideways, making way for Bessy to enter. Bessy looked at the emergency room behind her, separated by a white curtain and blocking everything from sight. Her hands shook and she couldn't take a step forward. Daniel tucked his mask into his pocket and whispered,
"Go in, it might be too late."
Bessy closed her eyes and straightened up before going in. Grace's expression also changed at Daniel's words, and she was about to go in when Marvin blocked her. In the emergency room, Bertha forcefully regained her spirit. The EKG next to her was almost a straight line, yet she still somehow managed to stay conscious. Bessy stood 2 meters away from the bed, unable to lift her feet. Michael stood by the side and turned around. He walked over silently, reached out to take her wrist, and then led her to Bertha.
"Look, she's here."
"Bessy, Grandma is very, very happy. I can finally see your grandpa now."
Bertha's voice was weak and wispy, and she barely managed to look up at Michael. Finally, her eyes turned soft and generous, and she looked at Bessy.
"You must be obedient and listen to Mr. Clark."
This was the last breath she held on to. She was most afraid for Bessy and couldn't bear to let her go. She was also afraid that Bessy would eventually be alone forever. She watched as Bessy nodded, her eyes red. Bertha's hand slowly loosened around Bessy's hand, and she closed her eyes calmly. Her mouth seemed to be smiling as she eventually dropped her hand to the side of the bed and stopped moving. Bessy knelt beside the bed, staring at Bertha's hand. She continued holding on to her hand and didn't even dare to blink. She was frozen in place and even forgot to cry. Outside, the silence in the emergency room was a little strange, and from the reaction of the dean and the others, Grace and Andrea panicked. Samuel and David also guessed the situation. Even Robert, who rarely stayed silent, didn't ask Daniel anything. Michael came out and glanced at Grace and the others before finally saying,
"Whoever wants to go in to see her for the last time, go in."
A few suppressed cries finally overflowed. Andrea's movement wasn't very capable, but she limped and tried to run in. Grace followed behind her, and even Susan also temporarily forgot about other things. Soon, the emergency room was full of movement. and bursts of crying came like a pot of boiling water. Daniel glanced at Michael and asked,
Bessy, how is she?
Michael glanced at him and said nothing. After a moment, he looked at the dean and said softly,
Find a funeral home.
The dean nodded. It wasn't convenient for him to speak during such an occasion, so he greeted Michael and left directly. Not far away, Mayor Grant was also stunned for a long time before he went to make a call in a daze.
Michael, about today's delayed flight.
Samuel looked at Michael. Michael turned and stared at the emergency room with his dark eyes.
Yes, I have noted it down.
After a long while, he gave some instructions to Marvin.
Mr. Grinch should still be in Chicago.
Michael asked, glancing at Marvin. Marvin picked up his phone with a solemn expression and nodded silently.
Okay.
Michael nodded and lowered his voice, sounding husky.
Call Mr. Grint and Principal White.
Mr. Grint knew Bertha and was also Bessy's teacher, so he must appear on such an occasion. As for Principal White, Michael wasn't too certain. At night, neither Grace nor Andrea left. David and Daryl originally thought that they would have to tire themselves over settling the matter. However, they didn't even have to see Bertha's body. Michael had already organized everything in an orderly manner. The two of them arrived in the Smith family's car and left in it too. Marvin only told them the time and address of the funeral. On the way back, Daryl had yet to react. He glanced at David in the back seat and finally burst out.
Today, Mayor Grant, that Robert and Dr. Brown.
Daryl was in a daze and couldn't think straight. He had received too much information in the hospital and had even received the news of Bertha's death, so he really couldn't think too much. It was only now that he slowly reacted. His head felt dizzy and it seemed like something had exploded inside. They were unable to guess Robert, Samuel, and Michael's identities, but they knew Mayor Grant. He was the mayor. The Smith family had found it difficult to climb further up in society. For some reason, Daryl felt painful heartache. Mayor Grant had called. He had called Bessy as Bessy and Bertha as Miss Wilson.
Say, Anne's grandma and Bessy, who are they?
Daryl glanced at David. Who was Bertha? Who were those people? These were all questions that Daryl desperately wanted to know the answers to. If Daryl didn't know, David naturally didn't either. They sat in the back seat and a moment of silence fell.
Call Anne.
After a long while, Daryl finally returned to his senses and looked to the side. Grace was probably not in the right state of mind to inform Anne. David nodded and took out his phone to call Anne. She had to be informed about Bertha. Mr. Anderson's class had just ended when she received the phone call. Mr. Anderson's class wasn't easy at all, and even though she was a personal student, he still had many other students, and everyone was competing with one another. So Anne had to pull herself together and work harder than other people. She had already been accustomed to this since she was young. To obtain more, she had to work harder than the average person. My grandma. Anne held her phone and walked out of Mr. Anderson's class. The capital was far colder than Chicago, so she was wrapped in a big scarf that still couldn't block out the cold wind. She said in an almost confused voice, Dad, Mr. Anderson is bringing me to Austria tomorrow to participate in an important meeting.
An important meeting?
David glanced at Daryl. Episode 167. Everyone arrives for the funeral. Daryl pondered for a long time before taking the phone and gently telling Anne to attend the meeting. Mr. Anderson was now working hard to develop Anne. If they missed the opportunity now, it was difficult to determine if he would continue to work hard to train her. Daryl was good at assessing the overall situation and helped her decide without hesitating. He said a few words to Anne and then hung up the phone. David was almost speechless.
Dad,
Daryl shook his head.
Bertha has already passed.
Over in Evanston, Anne hung up the phone and pulled on her scarf with one hand. She lowered her eyes and thought that she had never been close to Bertha since she was young. Bertha hadn't liked her either, so Anne didn't feel anything in her heart for her death. It was useless for her to go to Bertha's funeral. She would just be wasting her time. But Mr. Anderson, on the other hand, could bring her to Austria to participate in the meeting. There, she could meet many violin masters at the palace level. Comparing Bertha's funeral to the exchange meeting, she didn't even have to hesitate over which one to choose. Anne hardly thought about it and came to a decision. Mr. Grint was at the Madison International Hotel. He had stayed in Chicago recently and had dealt with some matters at the Violin Association and also had tea with Principal White often. The two of them were not in the same circle in Evanston. Mr. Grint had always heard of the legend of Principal White in Evanston, but he rarely saw him in person and only met him on a few banquet occasions. But thanks to Bessy, the two of them from different circles had crossed paths. They mostly roasted Bessy's ruthless history.
"I didn't expect you to choose Bessy in the end,"
Principal White said. Mr. Grint shook his head and laughed. At most, his apprentice would stir up a wave in the violin world in Evanston, and the media would probably spread the gossip without restraint. But with Principal White, as soon as his successor was announced, the entirety of Evanston would be shaken to the core. Principal White shook his head and glanced silently at Mr. Grint. Things had not begun to take shape for him yet, so he couldn't be as joyful as Mr. Grint. Mr. Sampson brewed a pot of tea and first poured a cup for Principal White. He watched as the green tea poured into the white porcelain cup, stopping before it was filled to the brim. Not far away, on top of a cabinet, Mr. Grint's phone rang. Mr. Sampson poured a tea for Mr. Grint and then walked over to look at it.
"Mr. Grint, it's a number from Evanston."
It was from an unknown number. Countless people looked for Mr. Grint every day from all over the world. Mr. Grint wasn't surprised and just picked up after nodding to Principal White. It was Marvin. He explained Bertha's situation and told Mr. Grint about the time. Then, he politely hung up. Mr. Grint had expected this to happen when he came to Chicago, but he didn't expect it to happen so soon, and was so shocked he even forgot to put his phone down.
"What's wrong?"
Principal White looked at Mr. Grint expectantly, but before he could continue, his phone also rang. Bessy was in the hospital and had barely moved an inch. Michael finished his phone calls outside and came back in. He ignored Grace, Andrea, and the others and directly squatted next to Bessy. He asked in a gentle voice,
"I didn't let anyone touch your grandma's ward. Do you want to come to pick up her things with me?"
The group of bodyguards was still outside, and Samuel had taken a few to look around for suspicious figures in the hospital. Bessy seemed to react finally, and her pair of dark eyes focused. She tilted her head slightly and stared at Michael. Her face was cold and her eyes were drooping. There was no breathtaking color on her face like in the past. It seemed like a desolate desert. Michael couldn't bear to look and turned away. He stood up and reached out to her.
"Let's go."
Bessy finally raised her hand after a long while. Michael led her slowly to Bertha's ward. It took almost 10 minutes for them to get there. Bertha didn't have many things in her ward. She seemed to have a hunch before her death and had already distributed all of her things to her 4 grandchildren. Susan and Anne had looked down on her things, so she had given them to Bessy and Pete. All that was left was her clothes and some of her old things, as well as her drinking glass and the coat she wore outside just today. Bessy lowered her head and packed in silence. Bertha had lived in the ward for nearly a year, and it was almost like living in a rented apartment. She finally put away the cups that Bertha drank from most often. The last hint of Bertha was gone in the room. Bessy surveyed the room again, and a huge sense of panic bubbled in her heart. Someone knocked on the door outside. Marvin came in. He handed Michael a list.
"Michael, everything has been arranged. The funeral home has also been notified about the cremation."
Marvin was methodical and had arranged the trivial things. Michael nodded and asked him to go out first. After Bertha's death, both Grace and Andrea collapsed, so Michael handled all the follow-up matters and didn't let the Smith family touch anything. Standing in the room, Bessy heard their conversation and blinked her eyes. She turned blankly to Michael and said in a hoarse and rough voice, "My grandma." Michael felt distraught at her frail appearance, so he reached out to bring her into his arms. He looked out the dark window, thinking of the person who stopped the flight today. His eyes were extremely cold, but his voice was very soft and gentle as he said,
"Your grandma has gone to find your grandpa."
Bessy reached out and grabbed his lapel. The familiar cold fragrance of him calmed her down, and she seemed to return to her senses now. Before long, Michael felt his shirt become wet. Half an hour later, Bessy left the room. She took a piece of paper and a pen and wrote down some phone numbers one by one. There were not many relatives in the Wilson family. Bessy had flipped through Bertha's phone and remembered most of the numbers. After writing them down, she went directly to Pete upstairs. "Pete, notify these people." She handed the paper to Pete, her voice cold as always. Except for her pair of blood-red eyes, she almost seemed the same as before.
"Bessy."
Marvin came in from outside and handed her a piece of paper.
"Michael told me to give this to you. Mr. Brown asked me to tell you to let him know if there is anything."
Bessy reached for the paper and nodded. "Ask him to contact the Madison International Hotel. The room from last time is still there and—" She instructed him step by step, her every movement as if she had always been in a high position. Her pair of slightly squinted eyes were extremely cold. In Grace's eyes, Bessy had always been a poor student who didn't study well, was confused, and didn't have a goal in life. She was the same as Bertha and had never been motivated. This was the first time she saw Bessy behave like this.
"Bessy, you—"
Grace stared at Bessy, stunned. Bessy ignored her and walked forward to instruct Marvin. Grace stared at Bessy's back and realized for the first time that Bessy seemed to have changed. She was completely different from what Grace had imagined. Especially, her attitude towards all of them had changed. Everyone had been notified about Bertha's funeral. 2 of the Wilson family members saw that it was organized by Andrea and Pete and didn't come. The address chosen was a cemetery on the outskirts of the city. Bertha had already bought a spot for herself next to Bessy's grandpa. After a few days of snow, there was a layer of white on the ground. Bessy and Pete stood on both sides of the funeral hall. Bodyguards borrowed by Michael from Rick filled the room, wearing black suits with white flowers on their chests. It was like the funeral of an important leader, the atmosphere solemn and heavy.
"Bessy, Pete, don't be too sad."
David and Daryl came over early, holding a white flower each in their hands. Grace's voice was hoarse as she said,
"Dad, this way."
She took David and Daryl in. Behind Daryl and David, 2 elderly men over the age of 50 also came in. Both men wore black clothes. The man on the left was thin, and his face bore a faintly solemn expression. His eyes were slightly cloudy, and his gait was calm. On the right side, the man was of a staggering old age. His white hair was visible on his temples, and he wore a gray scarf around his neck. His eyebrows were light, and his benevolent and kind eyes were somewhat calm. It was Principal White and Mr. Grint. It was still snowing outside, so even though relatives had been dutifully notified, not many people came to see Bertha. Pete knew almost all of them. He had seen Mr. Grint at Bessy's apprenticeship banquet before and recognized him, but he had never seen Principal White before. Principal White rarely showed up in school, and even some teachers found it difficult to see him, much less an ordinary high school student like Pete. He glanced at Bessy subconsciously. Bessy bowed to them before telling Pete, "This is Principal White." Pete nodded and returned the salute.
"Mr. Grint, Principal White."
Mr. Grint patted Pete's shoulder solemnly. He recognized Pete from the apprenticeship banquet and said a few words to him.
"Pete, if anything happens in the future, you can come to find me."
Principal White also glanced at Pete. After all, this was the first relative Bessy had introduced to him. So he was silent for a moment while Mr. Grint talked. Then he showed an amiable attitude and said,
"Pete, if you have any problems in the future, come to the principal's office directly and find me."
Episode 168. Professor Wilson? There were other people behind them, so the 2 old men didn't stay long and went into the funeral hall. Inside the funeral hall were Grace, Andrea, Susan, and some other relatives. Andrea's movements were uncoordinated, and she half knelt by the side of the others. Grace and Susan mainly received the guests. Grace was receiving David and Daryl. They stood up after they paid their respects to Bertha. At this time, Mr. Grint and Principal White also entered. Susan's face was pale as she bowed to them, but she didn't recognize them. She only felt like these 2 well-groomed men in suits didn't seem like relatives of the Wilson family at all. They had a strong aura, especially the old man on the left, who appeared scarier than Daryl. Susan thought he was a relative of the Smith family, so he called Grace over. Grace turned around and saw Mr. Grint and Principal White. Needless to say, she recognized Principal White, whom she had heard was the headmaster of the school. As for Mr. Grint, it was even more obvious. Anne had gone to Evanston specifically to find Mr. Grint. Anne's present teacher, Mr. Anderson, wasn't even as good as Mr. Grint. Because of this, Grace was extremely surprised to see the two of them at Bertha's funeral.
Principal White, Mr. Grint, why are you?
Grace's voice rose. It attracted the attention of others. David and Daryl were nearest and turned around. They had heard of Mr. Grint, but had never seen him before. However, David knew Principal White.
Principal White?
Businessmen were smooth and slick in establishing social relationships, so David only froze for a moment before reacting. Mr. Grint wasn't as friendly to these people as he had been to Pete. Bertha had mentioned the current state of Bessy's life to Mr. Grint before, so he was very dissatisfied with Grace. Naturally, his attitude towards her was cold. Ever since Mr. Grint successfully received Bessy as an apprentice, Principal White looked at him with respect in all aspects. Seeing Mr. Grint's indifference to Grace, he didn't say much either. After David and Daryl recovered from their shock, they wished they could become good friends with these two men. After all, there were not many opportunities like this. However, it was difficult to get close to them, so Daryl said nothing and simply waited to ask Grace later.
Miss Wilson, my condolences.
While paying his respects to Bertha, Mr. Grint glanced at the kneeling Andrea and couldn't help but sigh. He remembered what he had asked Marvin the other day as well as what Marvin had replied. Bessy had neither eaten nor slept and had knelt beside Bertha's body for 3 days. Outside, Bessy asked Pete to enter the hall and show the two of them to their seats.
Mr. Grint, Principal White, over here, please.
Pete's expression was blank, but his attitude was respectful, as he brought them to the space reserved for them. This was the first relative Bessy had introduced to them, so the two of them were very warm to him. Like an elder, they instructed him to study hard and not be too depressed over Bertha's passing. In short, their attitude towards him was obvious. Pete took them to the compartment. Susan looked on from the side with a complicated expression, her hands clasped together. During Anne's apprenticeship banquet in Evanston, she had heard about Mr. Grint the most. Thus, she naturally understood that Mr. Grint was more powerful than Anne's current teacher. After Pete ushered them away, Daryl glanced at Grace and asked her about the two elders.
I'm not sure.
Grace withdrew her eyes from Pete and shook her head. Once Pete had finished showing them to their seats, he went out to find Bessy. He was stopped by Grace, and Susan also came up to him.
Pete, just now, Principal White and Mr. Grint.
Grace pursed her lips and wanted to ask Pete what was going on. At the side, Daryl also glanced at Pete. Compared to his previous disregard for Pete and Andrea's relatives, he looked at Pete in a rather amicable manner today. Pete glanced at them blankly. Before he could speak, 2 men about 30 or 40 years old came in. Their expressions were imposing, and they didn't seem easy to provoke. Daryl and Grace recognized one of them. Rick ignored the others and set his eyes on Pete.
You're Pete, right? Your sister outside told me to look for you.
He nodded to Pete and said,
We will meet again in the future. You can just call me Uncle Soup.
Rick thought to himself that this way he would be in higher seniority than Michael. It wasn't the first time that Mayor Grant and Pete had met. Mayor Grant didn't talk much, and it was considered a warm gesture that he nodded to Pete. They walked to Bertha's body and respectfully bowed to pay their respects. Rick had also met Mayor Grant before, but he had never seen Mayor Grant so respectful. Of course, it wasn't only towards Bertha, but Rick also realized that when Mayor Grant was talking to Bessy just now, he was full of respect. Rick paid his respects to Bertha and frowned slightly while glancing thoughtfully at Mayor Grant. Rick and Mayor Grant were both very busy and couldn't continue to stay here like Principal White and Mr. Grint. Hence, Pete walked them out after they had paid their respects. The Smith family and Grace were not able to intervene at all. They didn't know Rick, but since they recognized Mayor Grant, they knew that he must be no ordinary character. Otherwise, how could he sit and stand with Mayor Grant? Uncle Soup.
Daryl easily thought of Director Soup. Regardless of who he was someone the Smith family couldn't speak to. When Pete sent them out, Grace, Daryl, and Susan all followed them. Outside, both Brian and Scarlett arrived wearing solemn black clothes. Scarlett seemed to be in very bad spirits and her eyes were swollen when she hugged Bessy. Brian held a cigarette at his side, his eyes downcast and his expression hidden. Bessy raised her chin and motioned for them to enter. She was silent, but her every action brought a sense of indescribable authority. Once they had entered, she looked at Rick and Mayor Grant and very politely greeted them. Mayor Grant was more restrained, but Rick's authority was more obvious. His family wasn't easy to provoke in Evanston, so nobody in Chicago would go against him. Even Daryl didn't dare to look into his sharp eyes. However, Bessy was like a fish back in the water as she hovered between the two, her tone neither humble nor overbearing, but sounding mighty instead. Between her beautiful eyebrows, there was a hidden sharpness, and her bloodshot eyes were like a living beast. This was the second time Rick had met Bessy after that time in the police station, and he felt like he must have had some problems with his eyes back then. How could he have thought that this girl was a little white rabbit? She was obviously like a wolf. After the two said something to Bessy, they returned to their car. Mayor Grant saw that Bessy was silent, so he finally sighed and left directly. How could Grace, Susan, and the others possibly not understand after seeing their attitudes? Mayor Grant and Rick's good attitude to Pete were simply 100% out of respect for Bessy. When Daryl had seen Mayor Grant in the hospital 2 days ago, his senses of Bessy had already been different, and now his heart was even more unsteady. Needless to say, this was true for Susan too. She dug her fingernails deep into her palm. Her relationship with Bessy back then had not been much different from her relationship with Pete. Before they could ask Bessy anything about these visitors, a black car with a red flag on it, bearing a license plate from Evanston, parked not far away. An elderly person and a middle-aged person came out of the car. They were well-groomed, dressed in suits, and exuded a scholarly air. They were no ordinary people. Who were they? Daryl glanced at Grace, but she shook her head to signify that she didn't know them. The two of them stopped in front of Bessy, and the old man put his hands behind his back and didn't speak. The middle-aged man glanced at Bessy and asked,
"Excuse me, is this Bertha? Professor Wilson's funeral?"
Most people didn't realize that the name Professor Wilson referred to Bertha. The two people looked rather elegant and presentable, and the car they came in was no ordinary car. The license plate was even more eye-catching. Bessy watched Brian and Scarlett head in before turning to the two strangers coldly. "You're here for my grandma?"
"If you're Professor Bertha Wilson's granddaughter, then yes, we're here for that."
The older man was looking around while the middle-aged man assured her. That was when Grace and the rest understood. This Professor Wilson, whom the two extraordinary people were talking about, was none other than Bertha. Daryl was shocked as he whispered to David.
"Bertha was a professor?"
David was confused too. He shook his head and said,
"I checked on her before. There was nothing that mentioned that Anne's grandmother was a professor."
He and Thomas were very strict with their criteria when they had looked for a stepmother. The first criterion was that the other party wasn't to bear any more children. The second was that her family background had to be clean enough that they were incapable of threatening Thomas in any way. Hence, he had looked at Grace's information several times to make sure that her background was perfectly fine. Grace was a rather pragmatic lady, and David knew that as well. But precisely because she was such a person, Thomas could trust that she would know what she needed to do to remain in the family. What Grace and Anne had done were all within David's expectations. If he had found out that Bertha was a professor, he might not have married Grace. At this point, he turned to look at Grace and realized that she and Susan seemed completely surprised.
"You didn't know that about your mom either?"
David asked. Grace shook her head. Her mind was in a mess at this point. She had been very ambitious when she was younger and studied in a middle school outside of Fairfield. The last memories she had of Bertha and her father were them leaving the house early and returning late from working in the factory. Besides Grace, Pete was also taken by surprise. He turned to look at Bessy.
Bessy seemed to have smiled for a moment before her eyes went dark. My grandma is Bertha Wilson. The older man who had been scanning the surroundings now turned to Bessy. He was in a traditional suit and looked rather stern.
Then we have come to the right place.
Episode 169. Secret Researcher.
May I ask you both?
Grace could barely mask her shock as she looked at them. Before she finished her sentence, Bessy interrupted her. You're from the capital? Bessy adjusted the flower on her chest and looked at them calmly.
We're...
The older man was about to say something. Bessy cut them off. She nodded and turned away as she said, Then I'm sorry. Please leave. My grandma already said she didn't want anyone from the capital at her funeral. Their expressions darkened.
Bessy, how could you treat our guests this way?
Grace glanced at Bessy, then turned towards the two men apologetically.
I'm sorry. My daughter's being insensible.
With that, she invited them in. Bessy didn't move or excuse herself from their path. She looked up at Grace with eyes like Grace had never seen before. Her words were cold and cutting. If you want the funeral procession to run smoothly, don't move. Marvin, Bessy called for him without even shifting her gaze. Marvin and Rick had been standing nearby the whole time. Upon hearing Bessy's voice, he brought 3 people forward. They looked rather cold. The 3 of them stood horizontally, blocking the entrance. The 3 bodyguards were no small fries. All the people sent here by Rick were specially trained elites. Although Marvin was a rather simple-minded man, the training he received had equipped him with skills that surpassed even the special forces. The 4 of them together made Grace take a step back. The 2 people from the capital had awful expressions on their faces now. The middle-aged man looked at Bessy and asked,
Girl, do you know who this is?
He was referring to the older man beside him. It was obvious that these people weren't to be offended, especially the older man. Grace got anxious.
Bessy!
Right then, a voice was heard saying,
Director Fielder, it's been a while.
Everyone turned to see where the voice came from. It had been snowing for a few days now. He was wearing a black coat that reached his knees. The buttons were undone, revealing the black shirt beneath. He also had a gray scarf around his neck. There was a black umbrella in his hand as he strode over. As he got closer, they could see that his handsome features had been highlighted by the snow in the background. It was Michael. His face wasn't recognized by many in the capital, let alone in Chicago. But as the old man, Director Fielder, saw Michael, his expression finally changed.
Mr. Clark, your family is here for this event too?
His lips were slightly pursed and his voice hoarse. It was hard to listen to him. Michael handed the umbrella to Bessy. He glanced at Director Fielder calmly and said in a laid-back tone,
If you go in there today, then I'll be involved.
Director Fielder looked at Michael. Michael wasn't moving or making way. He adjusted the scarf around his neck slightly. 3 minutes later, Director Fielder and the middle-aged man left without a word. The 2 of them left as abruptly as they had arrived. Their car drove off quickly. Michael glanced at Marvin. Marvin nodded and noted the car plate number, then quickly got somebody to look it up.
Is everyone here?
Michael looked down at Bessy. Bessy kept the umbrella and nodded. Michael took the umbrella back and handed it to Marvin. He then held Bessy's wrist and walked in with her, saying to Marvin,
Stay at the entrance and receive the other guests.
When he walked past Marvin, Michael paused for a while before saying to the bodyguards,
You stay with Marvin.
The whole time, the 2 of them had their conversation. It was as if Grace and the rest weren't even present. Too much had happened in these past 2 days. From the day Bertha passed away to Mayor Grant's appearance that same night, the Smith family and Grace could barely keep up. And today, Mayor Grant, Rick, Mr. Grant, Principal White? It was hard to meet any single one of them, let alone all of them together. Besides Thomas, perhaps nobody in the family would ever get to meet these people. And today, they managed to meet all of them at Bertha's funeral, including Marvin, Michael, and Rick's underlings. Too much was going on, and even David felt as if he was living in a dream. He had so many questions. What sort of professor was Bertha? Why wasn't it in any of the information about her? How did they know Mayor Grant and the rest? Why did they look familiar? And who was Director Fielder that Michael was talking about? They stood there in silence. Daryl looked at Grace and simply asked,
"Have you ever heard of a Grant family or a Clark family in the capital?"
He heard that Director Fielder addressed Michael as Mr. Clark. Grace had no idea where to look or where to place her hands. She shook her head in confusion. Elise married into the Perez family, which wasn't considered a big or powerful household in the capital. Even Anne's apprenticeship banquet was considered too prestigious for the Perez family. How many powerful and wealthy families had Grace seen? And even if she had seen them, she wasn't introduced to them.
"No."
Grace shook her head. Upon hearing that, Daryl didn't ask any more. There were only two possibilities for this. Firstly, these two families were ordinary. It was only logical that she had not heard of them. Secondly, these two families were so high up in society that the Perez family couldn't even get to them. So it also made sense if Grace had never heard of them. If this had taken place a few months back, Daryl would undoubtedly have thought of it as the first possibility. But with what had happened at the Madison International Hotel, Daryl had to believe that it was likely the second possibility. His sentiments were shared by David. Neither of them said a thing. Daryl turned to look at Pete with eyes that held an unreadable expression.
"Dad, did you know who they are?"
Grace asked, looking at Daryl and David's odd expressions. Susan had been looking down, but now looked up at them.
"Not really,"
Daryl sighed. Back then, he had pinned all his hopes on Anne. But now, Daryl turned around and walked in. He had to admit that although his judgment was accurate most of the time, he had probably made a huge mistake this time. In a villa in Chicago, Samuel got out of a car but didn't go in. Instead, he signaled for Simons to take his guest inside. Simons nodded and led the bespectacled man in a suit into the house. Only when they had both entered did Samuel turn to Marvin.
"You said Director Fielder addressed Bessy's grandma as Professor?"
How could Grace and the rest not have known about this at all? Marvin nodded emptily.
"Robert is very close to those in the research institution. I asked him and he said this sort of situation isn't implausible."
"Go on." Samuel looked at Marvin. Marvin glanced at the house and then lowered his voice.
"Some of them are the nation's top secret researchers. They signed a confidentiality contract, and even their families are not to be told. Remember what Mr. Brown said about the uranium?"
Only when the contract had expired, or if he was no longer involved in such business, was he able to make things known to his family. Until then, he couldn't leak any information. Samuel bit a cigarette and found that Marvin had made a lot of sense. But upon second thought, something felt off about it.
"Wait, no. Did you think about that yourself?"
How could Marvin know all these things? Hadn't he always thought that Bertha was just an ordinary old lady? Why would he guess that she was some special researcher who had signed a contract? Marvin was speechless. He sighed and said,
"This is Robert's speculation."
He had overheard when Robert explained this to Daniel. Samuel nodded.
"No wonder."
He reached out and patted Marvin on the shoulder.
"Go on in. Michael will need your help. I'll go over to Officer Gomez's."
Samuel smiled, knowing that Bertha's case wouldn't be settled so easily. Michael hadn't handled a case in a year. Samuel didn't know much about Michael, but he was sure that any case that Michael looked into, he would get to the bottom of it. Michael was sitting on the couch and saw that Simons had brought someone in. Simons looked down and saw that Bessy, who hadn't slept in days, had finally fallen asleep on Michael's lap. Michael didn't get up. He simply draped a blanket over her. He then pointed at the adjacent couch and softly said,
"Sit."
This was the psychologist that Michael had gotten from the Capitol. The psychologist knew Michael was from the Clark family. He sat down carefully and said in a hushed tone,
"I've received the report from you. This patient has a pretty severe case of bipolar disorder. This often means she exhibits extreme forms of frustration even on inappropriate occasions, and has trouble sleeping. With dramatic life events or changes in her lifestyle, her mental state could crumble and she'd be very destructive, but..."
The psychologist looked at Bessy, who was asleep, and said with some surprise,
"If she can fall asleep, that's a good sign that she could recover."
This man had seen many patients before and was a renowned doctor in the Capitol. Otherwise, Michael wouldn't have flown him over. Marvin was coming back in after his talk with Samuel. He stopped in his tracks upon hearing the psychologist's words.
"Destructive.
Michael tapped the edge of the couch lightly.
A change in environment would be better for her.
The psychologist presented the first aspect of his therapy.
The longer she stays in this city, the more dangerous she could become.
Michael nodded.
So we need a change of environment. That's right. It'd help her relax and the aggression she holds inside her would be reduced. I got it.
Michael then got Simons to see the psychologist. The psychologist thought that Michael had taken his advice. Before leaving, he gave Michael a few more ways to calm a patient down. Marvin saw that the doctor even took out a pen and paper and wrote down some things. He could barely believe it. He then looked at the psychologist expressionlessly. Calm a patient down. Given the situation now, if Bessy was going to kill someone, Michael was more likely to hand her a knife and a napkin to wipe her hands with. Calm a patient down? What was he thinking? Episode 170. A Trip to Austria. After Simons sent the psychologist out, he went back inside and asked Michael if he would like to head upstairs to sleep. Michael lowered his head and massaged his temples.
No, go upstairs and bring down my computer from the study.
Simons pursed his lips and wanted to nag him for not sleeping these past few days, but he swallowed his words after seeing Michael's disinterested face and just brought the laptop down. Michael turned on the computer and put on his headset. Then he instructed Simons to make a cup of tea. After taking a sip of tea, he set the teacup aside and then opened a link on the computer. In a few seconds, Christopher's face appeared on the screen.
Boss.
Christopher bowed slightly and took a step back, his tone respectful as always. Michael responded indifferently with a lowered voice. His tidy eyebrows reflected the lamp above his head and seemed to glimmer.
Have there been any changes in Austria recently? It has not been a day or two since people wanted to catch you, and that arms dealer in the slum housings, Andre, simply doesn't know his place. The Mass family just robbed us 2 days ago.
Such things were normal for Christopher. After all, in this business, he held in his hands an economic lifeline comparable to that of a small country. It was normal to have someone eyeing him. Even those veteran families couldn't help but want to take their share of the loot. But it was too hard to get a share of the loot from Michael.
Okay.
Michael stared dispassionately at the screen. When his tea was almost finished, he raised his head and slowly asked,
Is it fun?
Huh? Christopher didn't know what he meant, so he looked up and glanced at Michael inquiringly. Michael ignored him and lowered his head slightly. His eyes were still dark, and he chuckled twice before muttering,
There are so many people. It must be fun, right?
He couldn't help but squint when he thought of what the psychologist just told him. Bessy harbored some inexplicable sense of resistance to people from Evanston, as well as those from the Research Institute. Now that Bertha had just passed, it was not appropriate for her to head to the capital. It seemed like Austria was a little more lively. Michael reached out and clicked on the mouse. The World Health Organization was there, and Daniel and Robert had also just flown over in the afternoon. He summoned Marvin after thinking for a moment. Marvin came over immediately.
Michael? Go to the school.
Michael lowered his head and cleared his throat, but his voice was still hoarse.
Take leave for her.
It went without saying who he meant. Marvin nodded and asked,
For how long? Until the finals.
Michael narrowed his eyes and thought for a while before saying,
The exact time is uncertain.
But for insurance purposes, it was better to wait until the end of the school year. He had carefully studied Bessy's exam papers last time. To obtain a full score on such a difficult paper, Bessy simply didn't need to stay in school. As for physics, Michael had his plans. This was the first time Marvin had heard of a high school student taking leave in the second half of the school year, so his expression stiffened before he nodded.
Okay.
He turned to leave.
Wait.
Michael raised his hand and placed the computer on the table. He remembered something and said calmly,
Bring all the workbooks from the school doctor's office over to me.
Oh, Ray Soup's copybooks. Marvin once again tiredly expressed his understanding. Simons also heard Michael's instructions and followed Marvin out, ill at ease.
Marvin, is it okay for Michael to request such a long period of leave for Bessy? There are still 100 days of school left. What about finals?
After hearing this, Marvin suddenly remembered that Simons still didn't know how Bessy had scored in the top 20 in the city despite scoring 0 for her physics. Not only that, but Simons was also kept in the dark about Mr. Grint, Daniel, and so on.
Marvin had even seen Simon's noting down on a small book about how to tutor Bessy. He had even put on his glasses seriously and called people in Evanston to inquire about some things. Suddenly, Marvin puffed his chest and gave Simons a very inscrutable look. Then he took his car keys and walked out of the villa with his head held high. At the same time, Susan and the others were returning home. Andrea was in a bad mood and Pete asked her to rest first thing. He went to the kitchen and prepared rice and stewed soup. Andrea's legs had yet to recover, and she had tired herself out these 2 days. Although Pete didn't utter a single word about it, he still held it in his mind. After estimating the time, he turned and was about to head back to his room to continue writing his translation when he saw Susan standing at the door. His eyes had always been cold, but they had grown a few degrees colder these days, and no hint of a gentle smile could be seen. Susan was afraid of this side of him, but she still stood in the kitchen and stopped Pete. "Grandma has already passed, so you don't have to be so sad." Susan looked into Pete's dark eyes and couldn't go on. "Did you already know Bessy's friends?" She didn't dare to say more and just asked straight to the point. A black Mercedes had driven them back, and a bodyguard in a black suit had even been their driver. He seemed familiar with Pete and had spoken to him. Besides this, Susan also discovered that Daryl had personally sent them off today. This was out of the question in the past. Susan was no fool and naturally knew how the Smith family had thought of their family before. She knew that the Smith family was trying to tip the scale and sweeten the pot today. Daryl had purely meant to send Pete off. After all, Mayor Grant and Principal White had both spoken to Pete. Uncle Soup as well. Mr. Grint and Principal White. Susan never knew Bessy had so many big figures behind her, despite knowing her for so many years. If only she had known earlier. Susan trembled like a leaf upon discovering that her cousin seemed a far cry from what she had thought. Her heart sank at the thought of the previous incident with the ticket. Pete didn't answer her question and just squinted. His eyes were full of ice-cold glaciers and his voice was equally cold. "Move aside." Susan shivered at his cold tone and took a step back involuntarily. Pete returned to his room. Standing rooted to the spot, Susan pursed her lips tightly. Her expression turned dark and she returned to her room. She didn't read her assignments or sleep. Staring at her phone for a long while, she pressed Anne's Twitter before sending her a message. In Austria, Anne followed behind Mr. Anderson, wearing a dress. Tonight she had met several big names in the violin world. Not far away, a group of people surrounded a middle-aged man with a beard and blonde hair. The man's silhouette was distinct, and he exuded an aura that was unique to the other violinists at the exchange meeting. A sense of bloody oppression exuded from him. "Teacher, who is that?" Anne saw the master from the International Violin Association with the man and was dumbstruck. She couldn't help but feel very curious about the blonde middle-aged man. Mr. Anderson lowered his voice and replied, "That's the Moss family's butler." The longing in his eyes couldn't be hidden. "They're a royal family in Austria and would invite a court performer at the International Academy every year. It's considered a symbol of strength and reputation to be recognized by the butler." Mr. Grint had been invited long ago, but he had rejected it. "Austria's performance hall is on the street beside us. It's the oldest performance hall handed down by the Moss family." He pointed in the opposite direction and continued, "If you can hold a personal concert here in your lifetime, you're considered successful." Even Mr. Anderson himself had never performed there. "In the assessment next summer, if you succeed and become the first student of Evanston Association." Speaking of this, Mr. Anderson shook his head and stopped. He glanced at Anne and encouraged her to give it her best shot. Anne couldn't help but lower her head and take a sip of wine, suppressing her tumultuous mood. Without getting out of the narrow world of Chicago, how could she have known how big the world was? The Perez family was a shrimp in the sea of big fishes in Evanston, and in Austria, the people here were on a level she couldn't even touch. Her trip to Austria this time turned her head. She was enthralled in wonder, and she didn't even remember the news of her grandma's passing. She couldn't help but think of Mr. Grint. At this time, Anne felt even deeper that Mr. Anderson simply couldn't make up for the gap between him and Mr. Grint. She stared at the middle-aged foreign man, surrounded by people, and took a deep breath before heading to the bathroom. Putting her handbag aside, she splashed a handful of cold water onto her face. She was done washing her face when her phone rang. She opened her handbag and took out her cell phone. It was a Twitter message from Susan, and there was only one sentence. Anne, I saw Mr. Grint at Grandma's funeral today. Mr. Grint? At first, Anne didn't care. The longer she stayed in Evanston, the more she understood Mr. Grint's status. Beyond this status, he was also linked in countless ways through his network. Nothing could be felt, even if you connected with him. He was seen at Bertha's funeral? Anne pursed her lips lightly and didn't care. She took out her red lipstick and was about to put her phone into her bag. At this moment, Susan sent another photo to her. It was a candid photo. The photo was probably taken at Bertha's funeral. The picture showed an old man's side profile with his gray hair and old style. Anne had only met Mr. Grint once, but she had seen him thousands of times in the magazines and on the news. Hence, she could confirm that the person in the photo Susan sent was truly Mr. Grint himself.
Episode 171. Principal White is looking for Bessy. Anne looked at the photo and her hands tightened involuntarily. The light in her eyes also gradually diminished. She had come to Austria mainly because she wanted to know more people in Mr. Anderson's circle and broaden her views. So when she had to choose one of the two, she abandoned Bertha's funeral without hesitation to come here with Mr. Anderson. But she didn't expect that despite her efforts to meet Mr. Grint in Evanston, he would appear at her grandma's funeral. Anne had originally been ignited by Mr. Anderson's introduction this evening, but was now cooled by Susan's message. She was a person who knew exactly what she wanted and would obtain it one way or another. She never once regretted her decision, but now she desperately wanted to know about Mr. Grint. She quickly called Susan. At the same time, at Team OST's headquarters in Evanston, Toby wrapped a scarf around himself before heading to the top floor with the coach. There weren't many people on the top floor, and it was very clean. It was not the first time Toby had been here, but the coach behind him was about to see the head boss for the first time. He was on pins and needles and arranged his clothes from time to time. An astute and beautiful secretary smiled at them and opened the office door. "The president is waiting inside." Inside, a man stood with his back to them. He stood straight as a board in a silver-gray suit, and when he turned around, a faint smile was spread across his warm face. He looked like the child of a fictional family out of a fairy tale, dressed in fine clothes and well-groomed, as if all the elegance of the world was garnered on him alone. The color of heaven in the form of a man. OST's coach glanced at him and then looked down, not daring to exchange eye contact. Toby sat down on an empty chair casually and said rigidly, "Sir." The man nodded, then reached out and politely motioned for the coach to sit. His voice was clear, and a sense of the forbidden could be felt.
"She played already?"
The man picked up a white porcelain teapot and poured 3 cups of tea. Toby leaned back, his beautiful face expressionless.
"Yeah, you've seen the live broadcast too?"
The man handed over the teacups to them, but didn't drink from his own. He just looked out the window and nodded after a while. Without saying anything, he left the room. The coach finally let out a long sigh of relief. Back at Brightbow High School, Mary sat in boredom on a bench and looked at her Twitter after English class. In a few days, her Twitter following had increased from more than 50,000 to 270,000, and it was still growing. As for Bessy's account, it had risen madly to 3.7 million. Mary estimated that it would rise to 4 million in a few days. Bessy had attracted a big group of fans after the game in Devil City. Many fans had come from Toby's profile to Mary's to urge her to make Bessy post on Twitter. It wasn't that nobody had tried to find out who BM and Mary were, but these 2 accounts were too strange and couldn't be revealed without finding a hacker. Of course, the people in English class held their tongues on this matter. Even when others talked about it, they simply smiled meaningfully. Then they went on Twitter and secretly followed Bessy's Twitter account. Mary glanced at Bessy's empty desk and sighed. Then she weakly took a piece of paper out and headed to the toilet. At the back, Paul was lying on the table and talking to Wendy and Kenneth.
When he saw Mary, he waved at her.
Kenny, when will Bessy come back to class? The physics teacher has been missing her for so long.
Paul stretched his legs out in the aisle and spoke weakly. Kenneth was doing some physics questions when he heard this. He paused slightly and shook his head.
I don't know.
Paul hadn't expected him to know. He propped his chin on his hand and said,
Speaking of this, I didn't see Scarlett and Brian this morning either. I wonder what they're doing.
Kenneth also narrowed his eyes. His grandpa had been gone this morning as well. On the other side of town, Marvin parked his car and inquired about where the English class was, but he couldn't find Mr. Scott in the office. As Mary came out of the toilet, he felt a sense of familiarity and remembered she was Bessy's deskmate who had used a fake flower as a daylily.
Mary,
Marvin called Mary. Mary was looking down at a piece of paper and slowly wiping her hands. When she heard someone call her, she turned around and asked Marvin, Are you here to find Bessy?
No, I'm here to help Bessy take leave from your teacher.
Marvin was solemn. Mary paused in surprise. Leave? How long?
Probably until the finals.
Marvin lowered his head. Mary was speechless. Oh, this seemed like Bessy's idea. Our teacher is in the philosophy classroom downstairs. You can see him at the stairwell if you wait a while. Mary looked at the time and confirmed with Marvin. So Bessy isn't coming back this semester? Marvin nodded while walking down the stairs. She followed him downstairs and pulled up her down jacket hat. Then could you wait for me at the intersection after you meet my teacher? I have something to give Bessy. Then she left without waiting for his reply. Marvin scratched his head in confusion, then went downstairs to wait for Mr. Scott. It was no easy feat to ask for leave for students in high school. After Marvin spoke to Mr. Scott, he thought that Mr. Scott would inquire further about it. But unexpectedly, his first reaction was a sigh of relief.
She can skip the classes, but she can't relax during her leave.
With the dean and Principal White indulging Bessy, Mr. Scott didn't need to report the leave before approving it. He tore a note and wrote 2 sentences before sealing it and handing it over to Marvin. After Marvin left, he picked up his phone to explain it to the dean, who immediately reported it to Principal White. Normally, the dean wouldn't disturb Principal White when ordinary students took leave, but Bessy was Principal White's focus point. Marvin stuffed the leave strip in his pocket. Then he wrapped his scarf around himself and stood at the intersection, waiting for Mary. Brightbow High School wasn't small. It took 15 minutes from the teaching building to the dormitory. Marvin waited for a few minutes before seeing Mary trot over. She held a black plastic bag in her hand. Marvin pulled on his scarf and examined it visually. It looked like a garbage bag. Help me bring these to Bessy. Mary stood upright and then flipped around in the trash bag. She took out 2 glass bottles before throwing the rest back inside. Then she picked up a pot with flowers in it. It's this potted flower. Water it every day in the morning and place it where she sleeps. Also, this flower is quite delicate. Mary took out her phone and asked Marvin to add her on Twitter. Then, she sent him a long, detailed message on how to grow the flowers. Marvin glanced down and was speechless. Did this pot of flowers need a specially trained gardener to look after it? But since it was for Bessy, he still carefully packed it into his car. He drove out of the school. But Principal White stopped him at the gates.
I heard that Bessy took leave.
Principal White put one hand in his pocket and pushed his glasses up the bridge of his nose with his other, deep in thought. Marvin rolled down the driver's window and greeted him respectfully.
It seems so. Okay.
Principal White pondered for a while before going over and opening the passenger's door.
Take me to her. I have important things to discuss with her.
20 minutes later, the car drove up to the villa in the city center. Simons opened the door and thought it would be Marvin or Samuel. Instead, he saw a solemn old face and was surprised.
Principal White?
As a resident of the small town of Evanston, how could Simons not know Principal White, a giant on his level? He was surprised because he didn't expect to see Principal White in Chicago. Could Chicago have illustrious heroes? Simons thought to himself. Principal White nodded to Simons before taking off his coat.
I'm sorry to bother you.
Simons hung Principal White's coat and answered respectfully.
I didn't expect you to come. I'll go and call Michael.
He went upstairs to call Michael before making coffee. Simons only realized after pouring 2 cups of coffee that Marvin had also returned. He was holding a pot of flowers solemnly. Michael glanced at the flowers and picked up the tea on the table casually. He didn't drink it, but just held it in his hand.
"Show me the Twitter message from her deskmate,"
Michael said. Marvin clicked on the message and handed it over to him. The message was very long. Mary had probably forwarded it from somewhere. Michael looked down at it and read through it slowly. He scrolled to the end and reached out to return the phone to Marvin.
"It seems quite complicated."
Marvin was solemn and couldn't help but nod conspiratorially. Wasn't it extremely complicated? A pot of flowers was so laborious. But he had yet to say anything. Michael glanced at him, casually, as if slightly amused.
"Put this potted flower in Bessy's room. You will take care of it from now on. If you have any questions, you can discuss it directly with Mary."
Marvin was speechless. After a pause, Michael squinted and added,
"Find a gardener and learn from him for a few days."
Marvin looked up and stared in disbelief at Michael. Was he so bothered about this potted flower? He even wanted him to learn from a gardener? After attending the special training camp for 3 years, his final position turned out to be a gardener? Episode 172. Goodbye, Chicago. While Michael spoke to Marvin, Principal White sat on the other side, drinking coffee absent-mindedly. Simons looked on anxiously. How could Michael and Marvin ignore their guest and talk about a pot of flowers? Especially when Marvin really came over with the potted flowers and asked solemnly,
"Simons, do you know where I can find a good gardener?"
Simons took out a small book from his pocket and flipped through it.
"There's the gardener who manages our villa's garden. He's from Evanston. You can note down his number."
They stood whispering at the door and they didn't disturb Michael and Principal White. Simons turned back to focus on Michael after Marvin noted down the gardener's number. He saw Michael put his laptop on his lap very casually, as if he was dealing with some documents or chatting with someone. In short, he had no intention of talking with Principal White. Simons said worriedly to himself,
"Michael, aren't you being too cold?"
Just then, he saw Michael look up suddenly. He said a few words to Principal White, lightly, but Simons couldn't hear them. He watched as Principal White suddenly put down his coffee cup. His expression seemed to change, and he directly walked upstairs. Michael stayed on the sofa, typing on his keyboard calmly. Simons stared at Principal White's back and asked Marvin,
"What is Principal White doing?"
"Oh," Marvin answered quickly in an especially light tone. He glanced at Simons and replied,
"Nothing much. He just wanted to see Bessy."
Simons was indeed stunned.
Why would Principal White want to see Bessy?
Could they know each other? But with Principal White's status, it was unlikely. Simons narrowed his eyes and pondered carefully. He remembered Officer Gomez had come to find Bessy before. Marvin's face was stiff. He couldn't answer this question and quickly pretended to call the gardener, leaving Simons with an inscrutable view of his back. Principal White's figure disappeared at the stairs. Simons suppressed his curiosity and went to ask Michael about Bessy's leave. He took out his notebook from his pocket. He had written down several famous tutors. Upstairs in the study, Bessy wore casual clothes and was sitting lazily in a chair. The curtains were drawn and she was staring motionlessly at the snow outside. Her eyes drooped, clear and shallow. Her usual sharpness was gone and only her solemnness could be seen. It seemed her grief might explode if given an opportunity. Principal White sat beside her in another chair, covered with blankets.
"Have you thought about it?"
he asked. He also stared at the white snow outside, his voice bleak. "No," Bessy said in a low voice.
"Because of Harry Rogers?"
Principal White pursed his lips and lowered his eyes. Bessy paused. Principal White gazed into the distance. He had gone to Fairfield for Harry originally. He was a genius who had far surpassed other people's achievements in mathematics, but had wanted to be an inspector instead. That occupation was exposed to the dangers of life and death. So Principal White had been distressed and wanted to persuade him personally. Unexpectedly, he discovered that Harry had died during that summer vacation. He had followed Mayor Grant around for a long time, investigating the truth of this matter, and he had even made use of his network in Evanston. Harry didn't even have a funeral. He was buried in Bertha's current cemetery, beside his parents, who didn't even have a monument. Principal White knew at a glance why they didn't dare to put a monument. Harry only had one sister left. Principal White then helped the younger sister handle the rest of the process. Harry had also mentioned his very powerful neighbor Bessy to him before. No. Bessy shook her head and stopped reminiscing. Principal White, let's talk about other things. She was silent for a long time. Principal White glanced at her and reached out to push his glasses up his nose bridge.
You told me you didn't want to go to Evanston at first. And you also declined my invitation, so why did you agree to Mr. Grint?
He couldn't help but turn and glance at Bessy, his tone bitter. Bessy was speechless.
I heard from Marvin that your grandma knew Director Fielder.
Principal White didn't rush Bessy to answer and continued to ask questions slowly. Bessy's eyebrow twitched. He said,
Director Fielder is in charge of Evanston's First Institute. He has third-party forces and countless talents under him. People in Evanston wouldn't choose to go against him.
Principal White paused and then continued.
Coincidentally, that institute is under my family's control.
Principal White was still smiling and speaking in an amiable tone. Bessy looked up and seemed to be in deep thought. She wasn't clear about the division of forces in Evanston and had never carefully investigated it before, especially those intricate forces of the old families. If Jared hadn't transferred files to her, she wouldn't have been able to figure out so many useful things, even if she hacked the entire database of Evanston. I'll give you an answer when I go to Evanston next year. Bessy squinted and relaxed slightly, but still didn't want to agree immediately. She hadn't checked on the White family yet, but she knew that they were not simple. Agreeing to Principal White meant participating in the power struggle among the White family. In the past, when Principal White had asked Bessy, she had always rejected him. Even if she said she would consider it, her eyebrows revealed her distractedness. This was the first time Principal White saw Bessy relax. He was overjoyed to see her seriously considering this matter.
When will you leave Chicago?
He was more relaxed after getting the answer he wanted and also leaned calmly back in his chair. Bessy stared at the snow outside. In a while.
Okay, then I won't bother you.
Principal White nodded.
I'll wait for you to return.
Okay. After speaking his mind, Principal White put his hands behind his back and walked downstairs ostentatiously. Simons had also finished talking to Michael and saw that Principal White seemed to be in a good mood after coming down.
Principal White, why don't you stay for dinner?
He asked. As a servant. Simons didn't inquire further. Although he was curious about Bessy, he only dared to ponder that in his heart. He didn't dare to ask.
No.
Principal White took his coat from the shelf and put it on.
I still have matters to attend to.
Marvin had also hung up his call with the gardener. When he saw that Principal White was leaving, he put his phone away and took out his car keys to send Principal White off. Now that everyone had left, Michael squinted slightly and yawned sleepily. He was about to turn off the computer when he saw an avatar jumping in the lower right corner. He casually clicked on it. It was a message from the old man.
Daniel has arrived at the medical organization. Beloved student, I heard from Daniel that do you also want to come over?
At the other end of the message, the old man in a white coat glanced carefully at the dialogue box, almost holding his breath. Michael tilted his head and squinted. He hadn't originally intended to return, but for some reason, he chuckled softly and reached out to type calmly. Yes. Boom. As if struck by thunder, the old man bolted up from his chair. Doctor, are you okay? This year's new student looked at him worriedly. The old man froze for 2 seconds before shaking his head slowly. The new student wanted to ask further, but the old man looked at him expressionlessly and said,
Don't ask me anything. I'm afraid you'll cry if I tell you.
A few days later, Bessy arrived at the Chicago airport at 3 o'clock in the afternoon. Not many people knew that Bessy was leaving. Only Brian and Scarlett came to say goodbye. Bessy, Scarlett wore her glasses and hid her eyes behind them. I'll see you next year. Bessy pulled off her sweater's hood and reached out to hug Scarlett. Take good care of yourself. Then she let go and patted her on the shoulder before looking at Samuel. Help look out for her in school. Samuel had insisted on staying in the school doctor's office after Michael left. He waved his hand weakly.
I'll treat her as if she were my sister, okay?
Samuel glanced at Scarlett. As the saying goes, take the bad with the good. It wasn't easy for Bessy to have a good friend, so of course, he had to maintain a good relationship between the two. Michael held a scarf in his hand and stood not so far behind Bessy. His good-looking eyes were squinted slightly. When he saw Bessy pulling on Scarlett, he cleared his throat and said,
"It's time to go."
12 hours later in Austria, Christopher summoned a group of men and narrowed his eyes.
"The boss is arriving in an hour. I'll choose one person to follow him."
The men had all been hand-picked by Christopher. Michael was lazier and rarely went out unless he had a big activity. He deferred to Christopher. The eyes of nearly 20 people lit up and they all took a step forward, obviously trying to make themselves known. They were all responsible for the diamond business in various churches and had seen a lot of unspeakable business. Hence, they always crossed paths with Matthew from the CIA. They would benefit greatly from following the big boss and receiving a few pointers from him, so they naturally fought for the position. Christopher nodded in satisfaction. He reached out and selected the first person on the left.
"Sergeant Wilder, it's you."
This was a valuable man from the military force whom he had personally cultivated. He was the best candidate to bring to Michael. Sergeant Wilder was overjoyed and came forward.
"Mr. Clark, what do I need to do with the boss?"
Not with the boss.
Christopher took out his phone to look at the time.
Follow Miss Miller and play with her.
Sergeant Wilder froze.
Miss Miller? Yes, the boss brought her to play.
Christopher nodded and motioned for him to keep up. Sergeant Wilder froze and clenched his fists.
Mr. Clark, I just thought of a training exercise I have with the law enforcement division next month. I have to practice well and have no time to play with Miss Miller.
Episode 173. Who are you? Except for Christopher, the people in Austria rarely saw Michael, but they knew a lot about him and would fight to promote themselves in front of him. Sergeant Wilder was no exception. But after listening to Christopher, it seemed like he was following a lady instead of a big boss. Sergeant Wilder had no particular liking of delicate girls, especially since the lady seemed to be here to play. It wasn't an easy feat being the leader of the group, and the deputy leaders of the law enforcement division were all waiting for a day to run up against him. It was precisely because of his efforts that he managed to climb up step by step, and was also fancied by Christopher. Christopher narrowed his eyes and glanced at him.
You don't want to go?
It's not that I don't want to go, Sergeant Wilder explained.
Okay.
Christopher looked at the time on his phone. Michael and the others were about to arrive, so he shook his head and said,
If you don't want to go, return to the team.
Since this person wouldn't sincerely follow Miss Miller, Christopher wasn't reassured either. Sergeant Wilder returned directly to the team. He turned sideways and looked around again at his group of subordinates.
Anyone wants to volunteer?
Although the group of men had been extremely eager at first, after hearing Christopher's explanation, they all bowed their heads and fell into deep thought. Nobody in the law enforcement division looked up at Christopher. After a long while, a weak hand slowly rose in the middle of the group.
Mr. Clark, can I?
Christopher glanced over. It was a thin man from the recruiting division with black hair and eyes. He was not as powerful as the men from the law enforcement division, but his eyes flashed with quick-wittedness. Christopher had only been interested in men from the law enforcement division. After all, Austria was far from America, and it might be attacked by terrorists. He planned to find a man familiar with the terrain and who was extremely capable of fighting. But now everyone in the law enforcement division had their heads down, hoping that Christopher wouldn't notice them. There was no time left, and Christopher didn't want to ponder further.
Come with me first.
The skinny man immediately came forward and followed Christopher. Sergeant Wilder and the others immediately sighed in relief. Christopher ordered a man to drive a limousine over before asking,
What's your name?
His men were divided into 4 divisions: law enforcement, recruiting, intelligence, and foreign trade. Alexander was in charge of the recruiting division. Out of the divisions, the enforcement division was the top priority. Their strongest forces were gathered in that. No matter which division went out, men from the law enforcement division would be transferred over to assist them. The skinny man scratched his head and answered,
My name is Sergeant Torrance Baldwin. Mr. Clark, you can simply call me Sergeant Baldwin. I originally wanted to enter the law enforcement division, but my strength was inadequate even though I passed the assessment. The division didn't accept me, so I transferred to the recruiting division.
Oh. Christopher nodded and glanced over at him. Just follow Miss Miller and play with her. Report to me directly if there's anything amiss.
Christopher saw that he was intelligent and just laid down simple orders. Bessy would have Marvin with her as well, and even though Sergeant Baldwin wasn't strong, he was clever. The opposite was true for Marvin, however. This arrangement was less than ideal, but it would have to do for now. Christopher wondered if he should find a female to follow her. At the airport, Bessy's plane landed. Austria was much colder than Chicago in December. Christopher ordered a man to bring a long down jacket. He was a trainer and didn't feel cold, so he was thinly dressed in a shirt with a thin suit jacket over it. His face looked sharp and angular, and his blue eyes glowed slightly. Not much later, Michael and the other three got off the one-way elevator. Christopher stood upright and called, "Boss," before passing the down jacket over. Marvin and Michael naturally didn't need the down jacket. Christopher had brought it for Bessy. Michael, dressed in a long black coat, nodded to him. He handed the down jacket to Bessy. Bessy was wearing a black mask and her hood was also pulled up, covering her face and revealing only her eyes. Her head was lowered as she walked slowly, following them to the parking lot.
"This is Sergeant Torrance Baldwin."
After greeting them, Christopher glanced at Michael and introduced Sergeant Baldwin.
"He's American and grew up in Austria. He's very familiar with the surrounding terrain and knows where all the fun stuff and delicious foods are. I've arranged for him to follow Miss Miller."
Sergeant Baldwin listened apprehensively and puffed up his chest. Michael put his hands in his pockets and narrowed his eyes at Sergeant Baldwin for a long while. He raised his delicate eyebrows and said forcefully,
"Okay."
Sergeant Baldwin was indeed clever. Seeing that Michael had agreed, he immediately went to Bessy's side. Christopher put his phone in his pocket and asked,
"Are we heading to the manor directly?"
Michael nodded.
"There's no need to look elsewhere."
Christopher had already sent his men to pick up their luggage. Marvin followed behind them while holding a pot of flowers. He had thought Michael had brought them here for a vacation. Hence, he didn't expect to see Christopher at the airport. He was stunned for a moment.
"Aren't you training outside?"
He glanced at Christopher and asked. His expressionless face stiffened a little, but his tone was still puzzled. Christopher saw that Michael was walking in front and whispered to Bessy, so he didn't bother them. After hearing Marvin, Michael glanced at Christopher and found it hard to explain in a few words. This silly Marvin had still believed they had been training outside?
"What's this?"
Christopher coughed and changed the subject. He pointed to the pot of flowers in his hand. Marvin glanced down at it and replied,
"It's Bessy's favorite flower. Michael told me to take care of it."
He didn't dare to reveal that he had become a gardener now. The car slowly drove into a grand estate. The estate was decorated exquisitely, and white carved pillars towered majestically. Upon entering the gate, there was a spectacular fountain, and past it was a row of 3 castles and several towers. They stared at the glorious style through the car window. Marvin had been sleepy because of the time difference, but this time he woke up and even yelped a little. Then he immediately stiffened his face and turned towards Christopher.
"Christopher, how do you rent such a luxurious place?"
Michael was indeed rich, but wouldn't such a large estate be too spacious for a few people to live in? This place could probably accommodate 1,000 people. Christopher glanced at him and stayed quiet. In the end, he simply patted Marvin on the shoulder silently.
"Boss, where are we going first? They're all waiting for you in the division."
Christopher was talking about the leaders of each division, as well as the main core figures of several teams. Michael didn't reply. He just glanced at Bessy and raised an eyebrow.
"Sleep first?"
Bessy hadn't slept for a few days and had been in a bad mood for the past 2 days. Her eyelids drooped, and she nodded at Michael. Christopher naturally heard this and ordered Sergeant Baldwin to park the car at the second old castle.
"The first room from the left on the second floor,"
Christopher said as he led them into the house. On the way, they bumped into several servants in white clothes, who stopped working and bowed their heads, afraid to directly look at them. The room wasn't a heavy European style, but a simple modern style with warm colors. There were windows on both sides, and they could directly see the large, snowy scene of the estate. Bessy pulled off her hood and glanced around. Christopher and Sergeant Baldwin didn't enter her room and simply stood outside. However, they could see Marvin holding the flowers carefully and putting the pot down on the windowsill. He adjusted the temperature of the room with the air conditioner and finally brought out a series of gardening tools from his backpack. Christopher was speechless. He felt like something was strange about this. After Marvin completed his work, he followed Michael out.
Marvin, that pot of flowers.
Christopher walked out of the gate towards the tower. He finally couldn't help but ask Marvin why he treated it so gingerly. Marvin looked unwilling to answer. Michael stood in front of the tower and seemed familiar with the place as if he had been here countless times. Marvin followed behind them curiously. The first floor of the tower was very empty. It only had 2 rows of sandalwood chairs and a chair in the middle. The imposing grandeur made them all tense. More than a dozen people were standing in the middle. Marvin wasn't sure who they were, but everyone looked fierce. One of them seemed to be a boss from the underground who had a scar on his nose. He looked imposing and terrifying. At a glance, he looked like someone wanted by the CIA. A group of people saw Michael and the others immediately gave way. Michael walked to the foremost chair and sat casually on the blanket covering it. Once the group of people saw him sit, they stood in a very orderly manner and greeted him.
Boss.
Their voices were full and thunderous. Marvin was at a loss for words.
Michael, who are you?
Marvin had felt like something was wrong the moment he entered the manor. His thoughts were in a muddle. Marvin didn't even hear what Michael was saying to the group. By the time he reacted, Michael had gotten up and left. Christopher didn't leave and waited for Michael to disappear before turning sideways and pointing at Marvin to the leaders of the divisions and teams.
This is Marvin.
He glanced at Marvin again, thought for a while and said,
These are the leaders of the divisions and teams. This is Sergeant Wilder of the Law Enforcement Division. This is Sergeant Leone of the Recruiting Division. And this is Sergeant Guzman from the Foreign Trade Division.
Christopher briefly introduced them. Episode 174. Why would she want to come? From the moment Marvin came in, these people had been sizing him up. After all, few people could stand beside Michael. They involuntarily looked away after hearing Christopher's introduction. They had heard of all the men under Michael. Among them, they had witnessed the terrifying powers of Christopher and Alexander and had also heard of Patrick and Marvin. They had heard of Marvin privately. He was Patrick's younger brother and had stayed with Michael entirely because of Patrick's request. Although he had been trained, he was not powerful enough to become a leader of the Law Enforcement Division. Sergeant Wilder was no longer interested and simply nodded to Christopher before excusing himself. Sergeant Leone of the Recruiting Division stayed and pondered things for a moment while staring at Christopher and Sergeant Baldwin.
Sergeant Baldwin, do you want to come to provide support tomorrow?
With Sergeant Baldwin's strength, he wasn't powerful enough to enter the Law Enforcement Division, but in the Recruiting Division, he was considered a master. Sergeant Leone regarded him highly. Sergeant Baldwin didn't reply and just glanced at Christopher inquiringly. Michael had just listened to their report without giving any orders. Christopher pondered for a while and then replied,
We'll operate according to Miss Miller's schedule. When dinner is over, you can ask if she wants to go anywhere tomorrow.
Sergeant Baldwin nodded. The leaders were all busy and Sergeant Leone was no exception. After speaking to Sergeant Baldwin and coming to a consensus, he left directly. After he left, Christopher glanced at Marvin seriously and said coldly,
Marvin, since the boss brought you here, there are some rules you have to follow.
Marvin looked up at Christopher, slightly dazed.
This is the boss's manor. You've probably heard the international rumors about the boss's identity. He's a diamond wholesaler. Many men have witnessed the boss's power. So I hope you won't try to outdo yourself here. But I also hope you won't make mistakes. Otherwise, even if you're Patrick's younger brother, I'll still remove you personally.
Marvin was the youngest among them, but because he was part of the Clark family, usually nobody put much pressure on him. Certain things were kept hidden from him by Michael and the others. Christopher didn't know why Michael had brought Marvin along, but since he was already here, Christopher had to make good use of him.
I understand.
Marvin bowed his head. Although he wasn't very clever, he was very clear about some things. Among the brothers, he was probably the last one. Christopher was of the same generation and was much respected, but he didn't even know anything. He deeply felt the huge disparity between him and Michael for the first time.
Also, starting today, you should work out properly and should not talk to Sherry.
Christopher was busy, and after saying that, ordered Sergeant Baldwin to bring Marvin along. He left hurriedly. It was 9 o'clock in the evening. Bessy had just woken up. There was no one in the room, and the soft sunshine shone warmly down on her. She pushed off her quilt and got dressed. The room was large, with a floor space of over 1,000 square feet. There were entertainment facilities as well as the pot of flowers given to her by Mary on the windowsill. Beside it, there were 3 pots of unknown flowers with snow-white petals. Bessy went to the bathroom to take a shower and changed back into her black sweater. Her cell phone lit up brightly on the bed. Noah Hyber was calling her repeatedly. Bessy ignored it and waited for her hair to dry before picking up the phone. She opened the message and scrolled down. Noah had sent a few messages.
Nico, where's the song you promised to arrange for me last time? Nico, did you forget what you promised at the coffee shop? I have to go to the recording studio the day after tomorrow. Pitiful. Nico.
A complete piece of music required not just a frame of the main melody, but also an arrangement that added flesh to it. A composer did not necessarily arrange music, but a person who could arrange music would certainly compose well. Bessy rarely composed for Noah. She mainly arranged every song for him. Her God-level arranger nickname was not given just based on her music quality, but also on the quantity of music she arranged. Last time in Devil City, Bessy had told Noah about the arrangement, but after returning to Chicago, so many things had happened that she had forgotten about it. Thinking of this, Bessy couldn't help but reach up and massage her temple. She clicked on the picture Noah had sent. It was a melody written by him. Tying up her hair, she looked around the room and tried to find a pen and paper. The temperature in the room was 71 degrees. Bessy didn't take off her coat, but opened her door directly. Waiting by the door was a middle-aged woman. She looked kind and said in English, "Michael is in the study on the 3rd floor. I'll bring you there." Bessy had wanted to find a pen and paper by herself, but after hearing that Michael was in the study, she silently followed after the middle-aged woman. Weren't there always pens and paper in a study? In the study, Michael sat in a chair, leaning lazily back in it and flipping through some documents casually. There weren't many people in the room. Only Christopher, Marvin, Sergeant Baldwin, and Sergeant Wilder. When Bessy came in, Marvin took the initiative to bring her meal over from the kitchen. Christopher had brought a desk into the room along with a stack of workbooks. Sergeant Wilder froze for a moment and paused mid-sentence when he saw her. Michael's head was lowered, reading the documents, and his expression wasn't clear. Sergeant Wilder glanced at Christopher inquiringly. Should they avoid speaking in front of Bessy? Christopher's expression remained unchanged, and he said calmly,
"Go on."
Sergeant Wilder was stunned and doubtful, but he nodded.
"The Moss family wants our goods. Mr. Alexander has no information from data intelligence. Furthermore, the Moss family has already contacted Matthew from the CIA. Matthew is a ruthless character, and several people have fallen prey to him."
Sergeant Wilder frowned. At the desk, Bessy pulled out a piece of paper and began working on the melody that Noah Hyber had given her. It wasn't difficult to rearrange the music. This album mainly followed ethnic and lyrical styles, and Bessy was also full of inspiration recently.
"Bessy, why don't you eat first?"
Marvin set down her meal on the desk. Bessy held a pen and crossed out a line of notes before redrawing it. With her head lowered and her pair of beautiful eyes narrowed slightly in concentration, she said a little impatiently, "Don't rush me." Before Sergeant Wilder had reported fully on Matthew, Michael pushed out of his chair and stood up. He put down the document. Then he walked over to Bessy, pulled out the pen and paper from Bessy's hand and knocked on the table, motioning for her to eat first. If it had been anyone else, Bessy would have fought him instead of starting to eat. Seeing that Bessy was eating obediently, Michael turned around. Instead of sitting back in his chair, he leaned against it and said lazily,
"Go on."
Sergeant Wilder looked down, not daring to look in Bessy's direction.
"Matthew has a lot of information about people. Many people guess that he has a powerful hacker as his ally."
Taking advantage of Bessy's mealtime, Sergeant Baldwin asked her about tomorrow. "Are you going to pick up a delivery tomorrow?" Bessy asked as she took a sip of tea. She was very elegant while eating, but she was fast and her tone was a little casual. Sergeant Baldwin nodded respectfully. Nodding, Bessy finished her meal and put down her tableware. She picked up her paper and pen and said vaguely, "Then you don't have to take leave. I'll go with you tomorrow."
Christopher had told Sergeant Baldwin that there was no place in this estate that Bessy couldn't go, and nothing she couldn't do. Sergeant Baldwin was clever and naturally knew Bessy's position here. He simply nodded when he heard this. Then he went downstairs to inform Sergeant Leone about this. Sergeant Leone was discussing with several leaders about the goods tomorrow. Hearing the news from Sergeant Baldwin, he narrowed his eyes, displeased, and stood up directly.
We're picking up the goods. What's she following us for? Austria has not been peaceful recently, and Matthew's movements are big. If something goes wrong, who will take care of her?
Sergeant Leone propped his hand on the armrest of the wooden chair and frowned. The leaders of the recruiting division also remained silent. Sergeant Baldwin had indeed found a lot of trouble for them. Sergeant Leone pondered for a moment before looking at Sergeant Baldwin.
Has Mr. Clark agreed as well? He asked.
Sergeant Baldwin didn't say much and just nodded.
Okay.
Sergeant Leone rubbed his temple.
I will arrange it.
Since Sergeant Baldwin was now assigned to Bessy, he turned around to leave after conveying the message. Sergeant Leone's eyebrows jumped again.
Where are you going?
Oh, Sergeant Baldwin reacted and smiled with his delicate eyes.
Marvin said that Miss Miller's flowers can't stand the climate here, so I'm going to the gardener to dig some soil.
Then he left in a hurry. Nobody in the recruiting division responded. After a long while, the leader of the recruiting division shook his head.
This Sergeant Baldwin is a talent. What a pity.
Even Sergeant Wilder couldn't steer clear of such a thing. Nobody knew how Sergeant Baldwin was going to get stronger if he rushed around every day without performing his proper exercises. Christopher was scrupulous in separating public from private interests, so even if his brothers worked under him, they still had to depend on their strength to advance. Wasn't it obvious how even Marvin didn't know all the facts? Sergeant Leone pondered all of this for a long while without speaking. Sergeant Baldwin was capable, and Sergeant Leone had always regarded him as a trusted aide. He never would have expected such a thing to happen. Sergeant Leone tapped his finger on the armrest and wondered if he should start training another trusted aide. Sergeant Baldwin might not work out. Sergeant Baldwin went to the servants' quarters for the servants from the back tower and found the old gardener. After asking some questions, he followed the old gardener with a shovel and went back to the greenhouse to dig up some dirt. When he arrived at the study, Bessy was still lying across the table. She was writing with her phone in her hand, while the black headphone cord hung down alongside her hair. In Devil City, she had already written a frame on Noah Hyber's theme, but hadn't had the time to write it down. Her paper was filled with words, but she frowned and crumpled it. Then she threw it at her feet and took out another piece of paper. Her side profile was cold and irritable. A cold air hung around her. No one dared to approach her. For a long time, she wrote on the new page expressionlessly. After looking at it from beginning to end, she picked up her phone and took a photo of Noah Hyber. Only then did she pick up her pen to slowly refine it. Seeing that her expression had relaxed, Marvin brought her a cup of tea. No matter what he did today, his mood was low, so after pouring tea for Bessy, he sat down and fell into deep thoughts about life. Episode 175. The convoy heads out. The atmosphere here was extremely depressing and completely different from Michael's side of the room.
Marvin,
Sergeant Baldwin said and handed a bag of soil to him. He glanced at Bessy and asked in a low voice,
"What's Miss Miller doing?"
She was writing an arrangement and there was a pile of crumpled papers under her feet. She would probably replace it with a new paper in a few minutes. There were several notes written on the paper. Sergeant Baldwin didn't know how to read music and barely understood what he was looking at. Hearing this, Marvin looked up blankly.
"She's probably writing some music. Bessy knows how to play the violin."
"Oh." Sergeant Baldwin nodded.
"Is Miss Miller left-handed? She keeps using her left hand."
Sergeant Baldwin obtained a lot of answers from Marvin without much movement. The study was quite large, but most of the people here were trainers. Although Sergeant Baldwin and Marvin talked in low voices, their conversation could be heard upon careful listening. Christopher sighed as he listened to them. After reporting on Matthew, Sergeant Wilder glanced at Michael.
"Boss, is Alexander back yet?"
The few leaders all knew that Alexander was a hacker. There were also rumors around the estate that Alexander had joined the Hacker Alliance, but he had never verified this before. Alexander often disappeared without saying anything and could only be contacted through Christopher.
Matthew had moved a lot recently, but Sergeant Wilder could only obtain information through Alexander.
He's not in Austria. He'll come back in 2 or 3 days.
Michael reached over and picked up his phone. He checked the time and gave Sergeant Wilder an accurate number. Sergeant Wilder nodded.
I also received news about Matthew's hacker. I don't know how much they know about the inside of our estate.
That hacker. Christopher also looked away and sat down, slightly puzzled.
Have you found out who it is?
Not a single piece of news. Sergeant Wilder shook his head and asked Michael.
Boss, do you know Matthew?
Leaning back in the chair and holding a teacup in his hand, Michael replied absent-mindedly.
I only confronted him once. He's always on his guard.
Marvin, sitting on the side and talking to Sergeant Baldwin, finally recovered from his confusion, only to hear the name Matthew. He paused involuntarily.
What's wrong, Marvin?
Sergeant Baldwin patted his shoulder and whispered, Are you all right?
No.
Marvin shook his head. He had just suddenly remembered that Matthew from the CIA knew Daniel very well, while Bessy knew both Michael and Daniel.
Sergeant Baldwin chuckled. Then we'll continue to talk about the journey tomorrow. It might take 2.5 days and the route doesn't pass by a hotel. Tomorrow, we'll go to the recruiting division and bring some stuff for Miss Miller. She might not be used to traveling this way.
At 10:30, the estate's lights were still brightly lit. Michael saw that Bessy seemed done with her work, so he asked Sergeant Wilder to leave. Bessy had slept into the afternoon and wasn't sleepy now. Michael thought about it and took her outside to walk around the estate. The structure of the estate was large and connected by cement roads. Cobblestone paths were interspersed in between the main roads. Bessy and the others were staying in the old castle on the second row. To the front was a row of towers with somewhat narrow windows and semi-arched gates that were staggered along the row. They were probably full of conference rooms. Many people came and went from them. On one side was a large fruit tree orchard, and the other was an open field. There was also an outdoor swimming pool built under the tower. Bessy had no interest in these European-style buildings. She stopped by the open field. The whole field was like a gladiator field, surrounded by piles of wood and collapsed terrain. Standing atop of one of the piles of wood, it was like overlooking the field from above. Even past 10 o'clock, dozens of figures could still be seen in the field. Some people were practicing shooting, some were hitting a folding stool, and some were practicing boxing. There was a myriad of activities. Bessy looked on with interest and saw a figure on the edge of the field. She raised her eyebrows in surprise and reached out to poke Michael in his side. Is that Marvin? She pointed at the figure of a tough guy. Michael glanced over with disinterest and leaned to one side of the pile, his delicate eyebrows arched lazily.
He just received some shocking news, so he's training diligently.
Marvin had always thought that he was Michael's trusted aide. But what happened today had given him an unexpected heavy blow. He was beneath not just his brothers, but also his brothers' subordinates. Hence, he turned his grief and anger into motivation. Bessy nodded and didn't ask further. She rubbed her chin, shook her head, and said distastefully, That's the wrong move. His center of balance is unstable. Michael heard this and glanced at her in amusement. Then he chuckled lightly, his dark eyes seeming to contain the crumbling starlight under the lights in the field. He remembered how 6 months ago he and Samuel had watched her fight in Brightbow High School for the first time. Bessy glanced at him and raised an eyebrow, as if asking him why he was laughing. Michael kept his smile and changed the topic.
Christopher told me just now that you wanted to go with the recruiting division tomorrow.
Bessy continued to watch their training and nodded distractedly.
I already told someone to prepare the necessities. Tomorrow I'm going to the Moss family's house to discuss business, so I won't be going with you. Marvin and Sergeant Baldwin will be with you.
Michael buttoned up her coat and pulled up her hood. Bessy paused and then nodded. Sergeant Wilder now lived in a row behind Michael's old castle, which was on the right of the law enforcement division. He came out of the old castle study and returned to his office. Instead of resting, he searched for information on his computer. Someone knocked on the door outside. Without looking up, he said directly,
Come in.
It was Sergeant Leone. He wore a coat and was frowning deeply as if something was bothering him.
What's wrong?
The leaders were rather familiar with each other, so Sergeant Wilder put down his mouse and stood up in concern. He gestured for Sergeant Leone to sit at the meeting table.
Why are you here so late?
Sergeant Leone didn't hold back and said directly,
I want the law enforcement division to transfer a group of people.
As everyone knew, the highest force of value of the whole estate belonged to those of the law enforcement division. Each leader had seen blood in the wrestling ring and had played with life and death before. Sergeant Wilder gave him a cup of coffee.
Go on.
The recruiting division didn't match with the law enforcement division. The military strength of the recruiting division was the smallest, but it was the richest. If they were no match for their opponents, they would use shady moves and guns. There must be some inside story if Sergeant Leone had come to borrow men. Sergeant Leone didn't hide the truth and poured out what he knew about Bessy's situation.
I've already asked Mr. Clark. If that Miss Miller loses a single strand of hair, we'll all die at the boss's hand.
There was no need for Sergeant Leone to tell him about this. Sergeant Wilder had already learned it in the study just now. He slammed the cup on the table and frowned deeply.
Are you going there to exchange goods or to play? What nonsense.
Now was the time when the forces of several parties planned to confront each other, and there was also a shortage of manpower. Next month, Sergeant Wilder had even prepared to evaluate recruits. But there just had to be a troublemaker to occupy manpower at this time. The two exchanged glances, their expressions extremely complicated. Everyone who worked behind Michael sized people up based on their abilities. The annual assessment standard was also judged in this aspect. Michael was undoubtedly a good boss. Before this, everyone in the estate felt that they could hardly find any shortcomings in Michael. Until today.
We're investigating something with the law enforcement division, and there aren't many men left. We'll give you a few people from the first team tomorrow,
Sergeant Wilder finally said. He had divided the strongest team for Sergeant Leone. Sergeant Leone was stunned for a moment. He didn't expect Sergeant Wilder to be so generous. Would he lend Sergeant Leone some men? He had thought that Sergeant Wilder would directly find Michael and ask for Bessy not to join them. He took a sip of coffee and didn't leave immediately. Instead, he probed further.
That Miss Miller, boss didn't introduce us to her today, right?
Sergeant Wilder heard this and understood what Sergeant Leone was thinking. He just glanced at him and shared his opinion.
Not introducing her doesn't mean indifference.
Marvin didn't return from the martial arts field until 12. When he stopped, there were still more than a dozen figures on the field. From time to time, people would stop and point fingers in amusement at him. After taking 2 steps, he stopped after seeing a figure standing not far away.
Michael?
He asked.
Yes.
Michael had told Bessy to return to bed first. Out of habit, he took out a cigarette and raised an eyebrow lazily.
Follow Bessy well tomorrow and contact me at any time if something happens,
he instructed. Marvin stopped and pursed his lips. After a long while, he bowed his head in shame.
Michael, find someone else to protect Bessy. I'm not capable enough.
Even the weakest man from the law enforcement hall could bring him to his knees. Michael raised an eyebrow and straightened his coat. He glanced at him and said clearly,
What made you think that I meant for you to protect Bessy?
Marvin froze. Michael looked away. His tone was clear and slow as he said rather affectionately,
I'm letting you take care of her flowers and her chores.
Marvin was speechless. Michael left at 6 the next morning. Bessy was still sleeping when he left, so he didn't wake her up. It was already 7 o'clock when Bessy got up. When she came out from her shower and ate her breakfast, Marvin had already wrapped the pot of flowers. Sergeant Baldwin held a large suitcase in his hand and said,
Miss Miller, we can set off now.
A convoy was already parked at the gate of the estate. More than a dozen figures stood on both sides. Sergeant Leone stood in the center, giving orders sharply. When he saw Bessy coming out, he paused.
Miss Miller,
he greeted her extremely politely.
Your car is the one in the middle.
This was the first time Sergeant Leone had seen Bessy. Seeing her beautiful young face, he felt even more ill at ease. Bessy reached out and scrolled through Noah's Twitter message. She nodded distractedly and sat in the middle car lazily. Sergeant Baldwin drove while Marvin sat in the passenger seat. Once they were in the car, the men on both sides glanced at Sergeant Leone doubtfully.
That's Miss Miller? She's coming with us?
Other than a few of the leaders, nobody else saw that Bessy was coming along. Sergeant Leone nodded and said in difficulty,
Christopher said she's coming to play.
Everyone in the recruiting division fell into a moment of silence. She was crazy.